I want to start with the image that still wakes me up some nights, even now, years later, even with everything that came after it resolved the way it did. My mother, 71 years old, huddled under a dripping awning on a flattened cardboard box, her lips gone the color of candle wax, while 40 minutes away, in the living room of the house I paid for, my husband sat in an armchair and said nothing, while his mother drank tea from my good china. My name is Grace Bell. For 6 years, I was Grace Cross, wife of Daniel Cross, daughter of Walter and Louise Bell. This is the story of the worst week of my life, and of how I learned that the coldest, cruelest looking thing a person can do sometimes turns out to be the last desperate act of someone trying to save you from something so much worse. Something he couldn't risk explaining, not even to the wife who was busy hating him for it. I'm telling it because I think there's a version of this story that gets told a lot. The good husband unmasked as a monster. The wife who finally sees the truth and burns it all down. And I want to tell the truer, stranger version instead. The one where the monster and the hero turned out to be wearing the same face, and I had exactly one terrifying week to figure out which one I was actually married to. Chicago gets storms in early spring that feel almost biblical. Rain coming down sideways off the lake with a kind of personal fury. And that was the storm hammering my windows the night everything started. I was on the couch with my laptop, half watching the clock climb toward 11, waiting on a text from Daniel that still hadn't come. He'd left that afternoon with only a few words. Something's come up, might be late, don't wait up. Which wasn't like him, not in 6 years of marriage during which Daniel Cross had been, as far as I'd ever been able to tell, the single most reliable, steady, quietly devoted man I'd ever known. We'd built a good life together, or what I believed until that night was a good life. I worked in logistics management for a mid-size freight company, made decent money, and for the past several years had funneled a serious chunk of every paycheck into paying down the mortgage on a small 2-bedroom townhouse out in a quieter part of the city. A house I'd bought specifically, deliberately, for my parents. Not a mansion, nothing showy, just a warm, solid place with a little yard where my father could keep his tomato plants and my mother could finally stop worrying about rent on her fixed income. I'd put the deed in my father's name the day we closed because I wanted there to be no question, ever, about whose house it was and who it belonged to. Daniel had never once complained about the money I put toward that house instead of toward things we might have spent it on together. A nicer car, a vacation, the kitchen renovation I sometimes daydreamed about. He'd just nodded every time I brought it up and said something like, "Your parents raised a woman who takes care of people. That's not something to apologize for." I'd built a decade of trust on sentences like that. My phone buzzed hard against the coffee table, hard enough that I felt it before I heard it. The screen showed a name I hadn't expected. Donna Pruitt, my parents' next-door neighbor, a retired school teacher who fed my father's cat when they traveled, and who had absolutely no reason to be calling me at 11 at night in the middle of a storm like this one. "Donna? What's wrong?" I answered fast, already standing, some animal part of my brain understanding, before my conscious mind caught up, that nothing good comes from a call like this at an hour like this. "Grace." Her voice was shaking so hard I almost couldn't make out the words over the rain hammering her end of the line. "Grace, you need to come right now. The old Franklin storefront, the one that's been empty for sale, at the end of Oakwood. Your mom and dad, Grace, they're here, and they're not okay." "What do you mean they're there? They're at home. What are you talking about?" They're on the street, Grace. I was driving back from the station and I saw them huddled in the doorway. They're soaked through. Please, just come. I don't fully remember hanging up the phone, or grabbing my keys, or getting into my car. What I remember is the drive. 20 minutes that felt like an hour and a half. Wipers slapping uselessly against sheets of rain. Streetlights smearing past in long yellow streaks. My hands locked so tight on the wheel that my knuckles ached for 2 days afterward. My mind kept circling the same impossible loop. My parents had a house. I had bought them a house. Houses don't misplace the people inside them in the middle of a thunderstorm. I found them exactly where Donna said I would, in the recessed doorway of an empty storefront 3 blocks from the townhouse I'd spent 5 years paying off. My mother sat pressed against my father, both of them on flattened pieces of cardboard, already gone soft and dark with rainwater. Donna crouched beside them holding a thin plastic poncho over my mother's shoulders, like it could do anything at all against a storm like that one. I don't have words for the sound that came out of me when I saw them. I fell to my knees on the wet pavement and pulled my mother into my arms, and she was shaking so hard I could feel it in my own bones. And when she finally managed to speak, her voice came apart in pieces. They changed the locks, baby. They locked us out of our own home. Who did, Mom? Who would do that? She looked up at me with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget. Not confusion, not even really fear anymore. Just a bottomless, exhausted grief. Your husband, Grace. Daniel did this. I didn't take my parents home with me that night. I couldn't risk them crossing paths with Daniel while they were still shaking, still soaked through, still barely able to speak in full sentences. Instead, I drove them to a hotel downtown, checked them into a warm room, ordered soup from room service with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling, and sat on the edge of the bed until I was sure they'd both finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. My father told me what he could, in halting pieces, before sleep took him. He said Daniel had arrived at the townhouse that evening with his mother, Patricia, and Patricia's new husband, a heavy-set man named Wayne Duggan she'd married only a few months earlier. He said Patricia had come in screaming, calling my parents parasites, throwing a lamp across the living room hard enough to shatter it against the wall. He said Daniel, my Daniel, the man who used to bring my father a 6-pack of his favorite beer every time he visited, who'd spent an entire Saturday once helping him build raised garden beds for his tomatoes, had grabbed my mother's arm and physically walked her out the front door. His eyes were empty, Gracie, my father said, his voice cracking. I've known that boy 6 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at us tonight. He told me about the suitcases thrown into the mud, about the gate locked from the outside, and then, in a whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up, he told me about the black SUV parked down the block, the 2 men inside it who never got out, never said a word, just watched the house the whole time this was happening, cigarette smoke curling out through a half-open window. We were scared, honey, he said. We left your father's briefcase behind, the one with all our important papers in it, because we were too frightened to go back for it. We just walked. We walked until we couldn't walk anymore, and we hid in that doorway, and we prayed somebody would find us before the cold did. I sat with that image for a long time after he finally drifted off. My 73-year-old father and my 71-year-old mother walking through a Chicago thunderstorm because they were more afraid of strangers in a parked car than of pneumonia. Something in my chest that had been aching with grief for the last hour hardened quite suddenly, into something colder and much more useful. I left a note on the nightstand with some cash, told them not to leave the room for anyone but me, and walked back out into the rain with a very specific destination in mind. I drove back to my own house, the house Daniel and I had shared for 6 years, arriving a little after 1 in the morning. The storm had eased into a thin, bone-chilling drizzle by then. As I turned onto my own street, I saw it immediately. A black SUV parked across from my house, engine off, 2 broad-shouldered shapes visible through the windshield, one of them lit for a second by the orange glow of a cigarette. My father's description came back to me whole. I ignored the fear crawling up the back of my neck and pulled into my own driveway anyway. My rage in that moment was bigger than my fear. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stopped dead in the entryway. There, in my living room, on my sofa, sat my mother-in-law, Patricia, legs crossed, sipping tea from the china set my grandmother had left me. Beside her sat Wayne Duggan, a soft, thick-necked man I'd met exactly 3 times before that night. And in the armchair in the corner, staring at the carpet like it owed him money, sat my husband. "Well, look what dragged itself in out of the storm," Patricia said, setting her cup down hard enough to rattle the saucer. I ignored her completely. My eyes were locked on Daniel. "Explain to me right now what you did to my parents tonight." He lifted his head slowly, and that was when the real fear started, worse than anything the SUV outside had put in me, because the eyes looking back at me weren't the eyes of the man I'd married. They were flat, empty. A stranger's eyes wearing my husband's face. He said nothing. "Daniel, answer me." I took a step toward him, my voice cracking on his name. "You dragged my mother out of her house. You threw my father's clothes into the mud. What is wrong with you?" Wayne let out a low, ugly laugh from the sofa. "Educated woman like you, acting like trash off the street," he said, looking me up and down with open contempt. "Your husband's just tired of carrying dead weight, sweetheart. Your parents have been squatting in a house he pays the bills for while he works himself into the ground. What's so wrong with a man taking back what's rightfully his?" "That house is mine," I snapped, turning on him. "I paid every cent of that mortgage myself. Daniel never contributed $1. You have no right to touch it, and even less right to throw 2 elderly people out into a storm." Patricia stood up so fast her tea nearly sloshed onto the rug. "Don't you raise your voice at my husband. Everything you earn belongs to this family now, Grace, in case you forgot how marriage works. I have medical bills. I need that house liquidated for my treatment. 2 useless old people have no business squatting in an asset this family needs." I stared at her, genuinely, physically stunned by the shamelessness of it. "You're out of your mind. Both of you." I turned back to Daniel, tears finally breaking through the wall of fury I'd been holding since Donna's phone call. "Please," I said, and I heard my own voice crack into something closer to begging than I ever wanted it to. "Tell me this isn't you. Tell me they're forcing you into this." Daniel stood up slowly, and for a moment his jaw worked like he was fighting something down. Then his face closed over completely, and what came out of his mouth was worse than silence. "Go back to the hotel, Grace. Don't make a scene." His voice was low, flat, final. "That house is getting emptied. Your parents aren't going back there. That's not up for discussion." Something inside me that had been holding on with both hands finally let go. I looked at the three of them, my husband, his mother, her husband, and I felt a strange, terrible calm settle over the wreckage of the last hour. "Fine," I said quietly, "if that's what you all want. But I want you to understand something. I am not going to stand here and let you throw my parents away like garbage. This isn't over, not even close." I walked past all three of them into the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and packed enough clothes and documents to get me through whatever came next. Daniel stood in the doorway the entire time and watched me do it without saying a single word. His silence, in that moment, hurt worse than anything his mother had said to me all night. I didn't go home that night, obviously. I checked myself into the same hotel as my parents, took the room next door, and lay awake until sunrise, turning the evening over and over in my mind, looking for some angle that made sense of it. None of it did. Not really. The Daniel I knew didn't have a cruel bone in his body. I'd watched him carry my mother's groceries up 3 flights of stairs during a power outage. I'd watched him cry, quietly, at my grandfather's funeral, a man he'd only met twice. The version of him standing in our living room last night, flat-eyed and silent while his mother insulted my parents, didn't fit anywhere in 6 years of evidence to the contrary. But evidence is evidence, and grief doesn't get to rewrite what actually happened. By morning, I had decided 2 things. First, I was not going to let this go quietly. Second, I needed someone in my corner who understood the law better than I did, because whatever was happening here was bigger and stranger than a simple domestic falling out. A former coworker put me in touch with an attorney named Meredith Cassidy, a formidable-looking woman in her mid-40s who ran a small but ferociously effective practice out of an office in the West Loop. I told her everything over the course of an hour. The eviction, the SUV, Wayne's strange new presence in Patricia's life, the ice in Daniel's eyes. Meredith listened without interrupting, took careful notes, and when I finished, she set her pen down and gave me a look I would come to recognize over the following days as her particular expression for "something here doesn't add up." "The deed is in your father's name," she said. "That's the first thing that matters. Legally, none of them can sell or transfer that property without his signature, which means kicking your parents out into the street doesn't actually get anyone closer to selling the house. If anything, it does the opposite. It puts your father somewhere they can't easily reach him." She tapped her pen against the folder. "That's the piece that's bothering me, Grace. If someone wanted your father's signature badly enough to hire muscle to sit outside his house, throwing him out into a storm is the last thing they'd want to do. Unless the eviction wasn't actually their idea at all." That sentence sat in my chest for the rest of the day, an uncomfortable seed I wasn't ready to let grow into anything yet. We filed a police report that afternoon anyway, for trespassing and unlawful eviction, and I watched with a sinking feeling as the desk officer's expression shifted the moment Meredith mentioned Wayne Duggan's name. A small, tight flicker of recognition. He tried and failed to hide behind procedural language about domestic disputes being best resolved within the family. Meredith didn't let it go easily. It still took her the better part of an hour of pointed legal threats to get him to actually file the report at all, and even then, she warned me on the way out that she didn't trust it would go anywhere. She was right not to trust it. 4 days later, she called me into her office, looking genuinely rattled. A whiteboard behind her desk covered in names and arrows. Daniel's name, Patricia's, Wayne's, and one more I hadn't heard before, underlined twice. "The report's been shelved," she told me. "Buried, more accurately. And I found out why." She turned the whiteboard toward me. "Wayne Duggan isn't a struggling handyman living off your mother-in-law's goodwill, Grace. He's a compulsive gambler, roughly $200,000 in debt, to a man named Salvatore Marino. They call him the Anvil in certain circles. I'd rather you never have to deal with directly. Marino has a documented history of using intimidation, property seizure, and worse to collect. And I'd bet everything in my own bank account that he's the reason our police report evaporated overnight. I sat with that information the way you sit with a diagnosis you didn't see coming, turning it over, trying to make the shape of it fit something you can actually survive. Wayne owed a violent man a fortune he couldn't pay. Wayne had married into a family with a paid-off house sitting in my father's name. And somehow, in the middle of that math, my husband had turned to ice and helped throw his own in-laws out into a thunderstorm. None of it fit together cleanly, and the piece that fit worst of all was Daniel. If Wayne needed my father's signature to hand the house over as collateral, throwing my parents out into the street accomplished nothing except making my father harder to reach. It was, Meredith pointed out again, backwards. Which meant either Daniel had made an amateur's mistake in the middle of what should have been a carefully planned extortion, or Daniel had never actually been on their side at all. I didn't sleep the night Meredith told me about Marino. I lay in the hotel room, listening to my parents breathe in the next bed over, and somewhere around 3 a.m, I remembered something so ordinary I'd almost forgotten it existed. 2 years earlier, after a string of package thefts on our block, Daniel had installed a small battery-powered camera above the garage, angled to catch the driveway and the side entrance. It fed to an app on both our phones. I hadn't opened that app in months. I doubted Daniel had either. I opened it at 4 a.m, hands shaking, and started scrolling backward through weeks of footage. Raccoons, delivery trucks, the mail carrier, nothing. Then I found the night of the storm. The footage was grainy, half obscured by rain, but it was enough. I watched Daniel's car pull into the driveway hours before Patricia and Wayne's black sedan arrived. I watched him get out alone, go to the garage, and carry something out to his own trunk. A gym bag, bulky, the kind of thing you'd use to move a laptop or a stack of files in a hurry. I watched him look up and down the street twice before closing the trunk, the exact behavior of a man checking whether he was being watched. 40 minutes later, Patricia's car arrived. Then, 20 minutes after that, the black SUV I'd seen parked across from the house pulled up and idled at the curb without anyone getting out, the way a car idles when the people inside it are waiting for a signal. It wasn't proof of anything specific, but it told me something Meredith's whiteboard hadn't. Daniel had known what was coming before Patricia and Wayne ever arrived. Whatever had happened in my living room that night hadn't been a spontaneous cruelty. It had been staged, and he'd known it, and he'd used the time before they arrived to move something out of the house entirely. I called Meredith at 6 a.m. and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Grace," she said finally, "I want you to consider something you're not going to like. What if your husband isn't the villain in this, and isn't a victim of it either? What if he's the one running the operation from the inside?" I didn't understand what she meant, not fully, not yet. But the seed Meredith had planted days earlier, unless the eviction wasn't actually their idea at all, had just grown roots I couldn't ignore anymore. I spent the next 2 days doing something I never thought I'd do to my own marriage. I investigated my husband like he was a stranger. I pulled up old bank statements he thought I never looked at closely and found a savings account I didn't recognize, one that had been quietly, steadily funded for years, completely separate from anything we'd ever discussed as a couple. I found a second phone number listed on our cell plan that I'd always assumed was a work line, and when I finally worked up the nerve to call it from a blocked number, a man's voice answered with a clipped, professional, Financial crimes, this is Ramirez, before I panicked and hung up. Financial crimes. Not a divorce lawyer, not a mistress. A federal investigator. I sat in my car outside the hotel for a long time after that call, piecing together a version of my husband I'd never once been allowed to see, and slowly, carefully, a very different shape began to emerge from all the ugly evidence of the last week. Not a man who had turned against his own family, but a man who might have spent years building a case so quiet, so careful, that he'd been willing to let his own wife believe the worst of him rather than risk blowing it apart with the truth. I didn't call Ramirez back. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I drove to the federal building downtown and asked, at the front desk, to speak to whoever was running an investigation connected to a man named Salvatore Marino. I expected to be turned away. Instead, after 20 minutes of waiting in a fluorescent-lit lobby that smelled like burnt coffee, a woman in a gray blazer came out to meet me, introduced herself as Special Agent Denise Alvarez, and led me into a small conference room where she asked more questions than she answered. I told her everything: the eviction, the SUV, the shelved police report, the strange savings account, the second phone line. She wrote almost none of it down, which told me, more than anything she actually said out loud, that she already knew most of it before I walked in the door. "Mrs. Cross," she said finally, choosing her words with obvious care, "I can't confirm or deny the existence of any ongoing investigation. What I can tell you is that if your husband is connected to something sensitive, the worst thing you could do right now, for his safety and your family's, is to go digging any further on your own. If there's an operation in progress, one wrong move from you could get someone killed." "Someone's already been through hell," I said, my voice cracking. "My parents slept on cardboard in a thunderstorm. I think I've earned the right to know if my husband did that to protect them or to hurt them." Alvarez studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, the professional mask cracking enough to let a flicker of genuine sympathy through. "I can tell you this much, off the record, because I think you need it to get through the next few days without doing something reckless. Sometimes the people closest to an operation like this have to look like the villain for a little while, to people who love them, because the alternative is worse. Sometimes protecting your family looks exactly like betraying them, right up until the moment it doesn't." She wouldn't say more than that, no matter how I pushed. But it was enough. It was more than enough. I left that building with a version of hope I hadn't let myself feel since Donna Pruitt's phone call. Fragile and unproven, but real. That night, back at the hotel, I did something I hadn't done since the storm. I called Daniel's phone. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice careful, guarded, like a man expecting an ambush. "Grace?" "I went to see Agent Alvarez today," I said, watching his silence stretch out on the other end of the line. "I know you're not on their side, Daniel. I don't know everything, and I know you can't tell me everything, but I know that much. I just need you to tell me my parents are actually safe. That's all I'm asking tonight." The silence went on so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had cracked open in a way I hadn't heard from him in the whole terrible week since the storm. "They're safe as long as everyone, including Marino, believes I threw them out because I wanted that house liquidated," he said quietly. "The second anyone suspects otherwise, your father becomes the single most valuable hostage in this city. I couldn't tell you, Grace. I couldn't risk you looking at me different enough, even for a second, that someone watching us could see the truth on your face. I needed you to hate me completely. It was the only way to keep the lie airtight. I sat with the phone pressed hard against my ear, crying without trying to stop it anymore. 6 days of accumulated grief and fury, finally finding somewhere honest to land. "How much longer?" I finally managed. "How much longer do I have to hate you in public?" "3 more days," he said. "Maybe 4. I promise you, Grace, 3 more days, and I will tell you everything." Daniel couldn't tell me everything that night, but he told me enough over the next 3 days, in stolen fragments, a call here, a 5-minute meeting in a diner parking lot there, always looking over his shoulder, always cutting the conversation short before it could become a habit anyone watching might notice. Piece by piece, I put together a version of my husband's life I had never once suspected existed underneath the one I thought I knew completely. Before we'd ever met, Daniel's college roommate had died of an overdose that traced back eventually to a debt collection operation run by a man 2 rungs below Salvatore Marino in the same organization. Daniel had spent years afterward, quietly, working with federal investigators as an informant whenever his construction and property management business brought him into contact with the edges of that world. A world that, as it turned out, brushed up against far more of Chicago's legitimate economy than most people wanted to admit. It was slow, careful, thankless work. The kind that produced no headlines and asked, in exchange, for a man to spend years being willing to look worse than he was to the people who loved him most. When his mother married Wayne Duggan 8 months earlier, Daniel told me, he'd recognized Wayne's name within a week. A small-time gambler with an escalating debt to Marino's organization that Daniel had already been tracking as part of a much larger case Agent Alvarez's task force had spent 2 years building. He'd gone to Alvarez immediately, horrified, terrified for his mother, and been told, in no uncertain terms, that pulling Wayne out of the operation prematurely would tip off Marino and collapse 2 years of federal work aimed at putting the man away for good. "I begged them to let me warn my mother," Daniel told me, sitting across from me in a diner booth on the second of our 3 stolen meetings, his hands wrapped so tightly around his coffee cup that his knuckles had gone white. "They told me if I did, and it got back to Marino, which it would have because your mother-in-law cannot keep a secret to save her life, the whole operation would collapse, and Marino would simply move his debt collection somewhere federal agents weren't watching. He'd have come after Wayne, and possibly after your parents' house, with nobody there to intervene at all." "So you let it happen anyway," I said, not accusing, just trying to understand the shape of the impossible choice he'd been living inside for months. "I let it get close to happening," he corrected quietly. "Close enough that Marino's people believed it was real. Alvarez's team needed one more piece of hard evidence, proof that Marino himself, not just his lower-level enforcers, was directly ordering the intimidation and property seizure. The eviction was the bait. I moved your parents out ahead of the worst of it happening inside the house, staged the whole scene loud enough that Wayne's crew would report back to Marino that the family had been dealt with, and made sure Marino's people would move fast enough and carelessly enough to finally show their hand where a wire could catch them doing it." I stared at him, the pieces settling into a shape that made my chest ache in an entirely new way. "You used my parents as bait for a federal case." "I used myself as bait," he said. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I watched Daniel Cross's composure crack open completely at a diner table, his eyes filling with tears he didn't bother hiding from me. "I moved them out before things got physical inside that house, Grace. I made sure it looked ugly enough to be convincing, and safe enough that nobody actually got hurt doing it. And I have spent every single night since then hating myself for how much it cost you to believe I'd become a monster. Because the only alternative was risking my mother's life, your father's life, and 2 years of federal work that's the only real chance this city has of actually putting Salvatore Marino away before he ruins another family the way he's ruined ours. I reached across the table and took his hand. The first time I'd touched him with anything other than fury in 6 days. 3 more days, I said quietly. You said 3 more days. 3 more days, he agreed. And then it's over. One way or another. Those 3 days were, in some ways, harder than the week that came before them. Because now I knew enough to be frightened in an entirely new way. I moved my parents to a second, quieter hotel across town. Told them only that things were more complicated than they appeared, and that I needed them to trust me a little longer. And spent my days going through the motions of a life that felt, suddenly, unbearably fragile. My mother, to her credit, didn't push for details the way I expected her to. She sat across from me at a small diner table on the second morning, wrapped her hands around a coffee mug, and said, with more clarity than I'd given her credit for through the whole ordeal, "Your father and I raised you to trust your own judgment, Grace. If you tell me there's a reason to hold on a little longer, I'm going to hold on. I just need you to promise me you're not doing anything that puts you in the same kind of danger we were in that night." I didn't have an honest answer for that, so I gave her the only true thing I had. "I don't know yet, Mom, but I think it's almost over." On the third night, Daniel called me at 11, his voice tight and fast in a way I'd never heard from him before. "It's happening tonight," he said. "Marino's moving to force your father's signature through a private meeting Wayne arranged, supposedly to negotiate a settlement. But it's a trap to get your dad alone with people who won't ask nicely twice. Alvarez's team is already in position. I need you to keep your parents exactly where they are and not answer the door for anyone but me, no matter what you hear on the news tonight." "Daniel, wait. I have to go, Grace. I love you. Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know I never once stopped." The line went dead before I could say it back. I spent the next 4 hours doing the hardest kind of waiting there is, the kind where you have absolutely no ability to affect the outcome of the thing you're most afraid of. I sat with my parents in that hotel room with the television off, my phone gripped so tightly in my hand that my palm ached, jumping at every siren that passed on the street below, at every notification chime, at every small sound that might have been my phone finally ringing with news. It came a little after 3 in the morning, Agent Alvarez's number, not Daniel's, which made my stomach drop before she'd said a single word. "Mrs. Cross," she said, and I heard, underneath the careful professional calm of her voice, something that sounded almost like relief. "I want you to know before you hear anything secondhand, your husband is alive. He's banged up, and he's going to need some stitches, but he's alive, and because of what he did tonight, we have Salvatore Marino in custody, along with 3 of his top enforcers, on charges that are going to put him away for a very long time." I don't remember exactly what sounds I made hearing that. I remember my mother's hands on my shoulders steadying me, and my father asking over and over, "What is it? What happened? Is he all right?" And I remember finally getting enough breath back to say, out loud, to both of them, the truth I'd been carrying alone for 3 days. "Daniel didn't betray us," I said. "He saved us. He's been working with federal agents this whole time, trying to bring down the man who was threatening this family, and he just helped arrest him." My mother's face did something complicated and beautiful in that moment. grief and relief and shame and love all moving across it at once. And my father, 73 years old, sat down heavily on the edge of the hotel bed and put his face in his hands and wept like I had never once seen him weep in my entire life. I found Daniel at Northwestern Memorial a little after 4 a.m, in a curtained bay in the emergency department, a row of stitches closing a gash above his eyebrow and a bruise already blooming dark purple along his jaw. He looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen on him before. The particular exhaustion of a man who has spent months carrying a weight alone and has just, finally, been allowed to set it down. "Hey," he said when he saw me in the doorway, his voice raw. "I'm okay, I promise. It looks worse than it is." I didn't say anything. I crossed the room, careful of the IV line in his arm, and put my head against his chest. And we stayed like that for a long time, not talking, just breathing, both of us finally allowed to stop pretending. "I need you to know something," he said eventually, his hand moving slowly through my hair. "The savings account you found. I wasn't hiding money from you for any reason you'd think. I'd been putting a little aside for years, since before we got married, to eventually buy a piece of land and build us something of our own someday. A real surprise, an anniversary gift I wanted to be able to hand you outright instead of financing. When this all started, I moved almost all of it into an account Alvarez's team could access quickly, in case we needed to relocate your parents somewhere Marino's people couldn't easily find. Fast, with no paper trail leading back to either of us. I didn't care about the land anymore the second I understood what was actually at stake. I lifted my head and looked at him. This man I had spent a full week believing capable of the worst kind of cruelty, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as love reorganizing itself around a much larger, much more complicated understanding of who he actually was. "You should have told me," I said, not as an accusation, just as the plain truth of how much easier the last week could have been. "I know," he said. "I made the call that your safety mattered more than your trust in me in the moment. And I'm not sure it was the right call. I think about what it cost you every single day this week. But if I'm being honest, Grace, I'd probably make the same choice again. Because the alternative was a version of this story where your father didn't make it, and I wasn't willing to gamble that, not even to spare you a week of hating me." I stayed with him at the hospital until they discharged him later that morning, and on the drive home to a house that finally, actually, belonged to my family again, in every sense that mattered, I called my parents and told them we were coming to pick them up. That it was finally, genuinely over. That they could go home. The legal process moved faster than I expected, largely because federal racketeering charges built on 2 years of careful investigative work don't leave much room for a defense attorney to maneuver. Salvatore Marino was indicted on a long list of charges that went far beyond what had happened to my family. Extortion, witness intimidation, and a string of similar property seizures going back nearly a decade. Cases where other families hadn't had a federal informant embedded close enough to stop the worst of it before it happened. He was ultimately sentenced to 22 years. Wayne Duggan, facing his own gambling debts and unable to afford the kind of legal representation Marino's organization had once provided him, took a plea deal and received 4 years for his role in facilitating the intimidation campaign against my parents. Patricia divorced him from prison, a fact that struck me, when I heard it, as the single least surprising development in the entire saga. Patricia's own legal exposure turned out to be more limited than I expected. She'd known enough to be complicit, but not enough to be charged with anything beyond a lesser count of harassment, for which she received probation and a court-mandated series of anger management sessions she complained about bitterly to anyone who would listen. She showed up at our door 6 weeks after the arrests, thinner, quieter, genuinely humbled in a way I hadn't thought her capable of, and asked, haltingly, whether there was any way back into a relationship with the son she'd very nearly gotten killed. Daniel didn't forgive her easily, and I didn't push him to. But he let her back in, slowly, carefully, on terms he set himself, and I found, watching that particular repair take shape over the following months, that I respected him for the boundaries as much as I respected him for the eventual grace. I want to be honest about something that people who love a tidy ending sometimes skip over. Forgiving Daniel wasn't instant, and it wasn't uncomplicated, even once I understood exactly why he'd done what he did. There's a particular kind of damage that comes from being deceived by someone you trust completely, even when the deception was, by any fair measure, an act of love. My body had spent a week genuinely believing my marriage was over, genuinely grieving a man I thought had become a stranger. And that grief didn't simply evaporate the moment I learned the truth. It lingered, in strange places, for months. I found myself, in the weeks after Marino's arrest, flinching sometimes when Daniel left the house without a detailed explanation of where he was going. A reflex left over from a week when his unexplained absences had meant something genuinely dangerous. I started seeing a therapist myself. A quiet, patient man named Dr. Okafor, who helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't distrust of Daniel specifically, so much as a kind of residual hypervigilance my nervous system had learned during the worst week of my life, and hadn't yet figured out how to safely set back down. Daniel, for his part, did something I found more reassuring than any grand romantic gesture could have been. He made himself radically, almost uncomfortably transparent for months afterward. He shared his calendar with me. He called if he was going to be more than 20 minutes late to anything, no matter how small. He never once made me feel foolish for needing that level of reassurance, even when I could tell, some days, that the constant checking in cost him something, in terms of the independence he'd always taken for granted in our marriage. "I understand why you need this right now," he told me once, a few months in, when I'd apologized for asking him, again, to text me when he arrived safely at a client meeting across town. "You spent a week finding out the person you trusted most was capable of letting you believe something devastating, for reasons that made sense to him and made no sense to you at the time. Of course you need proof now. I'll give you proof for as long as you need it, Grace. That's not a burden. That's just what rebuilding actually looks like." That sentence did more to repair the last cracks in my trust than almost anything else that happened in the whole ordeal, because it told me something important. That the man capable of the careful, painful deception that saved my parents' lives was also, underneath all of it, still exactly the patient, steady person I'd married 6 years earlier. The deception hadn't been a mask slipping to reveal someone cruel. It had been a mask he'd worn, at enormous personal cost, precisely because the man underneath it cared too much to risk telling me the truth. My father took the longest to feel safe in the townhouse again, longer even than my mother, which surprised me at first, until I understood what was actually happening underneath his quiet withdrawal. For a proud man who'd spent his whole life providing for his family, being physically dragged out of his own home by a man he'd once considered a son had struck at something deeper than fear. It had struck at his sense of himself as someone capable of protecting the people he loved. He stopped tending his tomato plants that first summer back, something he'd done every single morning for the 3 years since we'd moved him into that house. And I noticed the neglect before I understood the reason behind it. When I finally asked him about it, sitting with him on the back steps on a warm evening in June, he was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I used to think a man's job was to stand between his family and whatever's coming for them," he said, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "That night, I couldn't do anything, Gracie. I couldn't protect your mother. I couldn't protect myself. I just stood there in the rain feeling like the most useless man alive, and some part of me hasn't figured out yet how to trust myself in this yard again. Like I don't deserve to feel settled here after what happened." I didn't have a perfect answer for him that night, but I had an honest one. I told him that the thing that had actually kept him and my mother safe that whole terrible week hadn't been physical strength at all. It had been his willingness to trust me, and eventually to trust Daniel, even when neither of us could tell him everything. Even when trusting us meant sitting in a hotel room, not knowing whether the man he'd once called son was friend or enemy. I told him that kind of trust, offered in the middle of genuine fear, was its own quiet form of courage. Maybe a harder one than standing between danger and the people you love, because it required him to let go of control at the exact moment every instinct in his body was screaming at him to fight for it. He didn't say much in response, but the following Saturday, I came by to find him kneeling in the garden bed again, turning soil with the same careful, unhurried patience I remembered from before that night. And something in my chest finally loosened all the way, watching him do it. By the end of that summer, the tomatoes had come back thicker and redder than any year before, and my father took an almost defiant pride in bringing bushels of them to every family dinner, as if reclaiming that small, stubborn act of tending something living in his own backyard had become its own private declaration that no amount of fear was going to be allowed to take root there permanently. My mother handled the aftermath differently than my father did, and it took me longer to understand her particular reaction. Maybe because it looked, on the surface, like she was doing better than any of us. She went back to her routines almost immediately. Her Tuesday book club, her weekly calls with her sister in Ohio, her habit of baking too much banana bread and distributing it around the neighborhood whether anyone asked for it or not. For the first month, I actually worried less about her than I worried about my father, because she seemed, by every visible measure, to have simply picked her life back up where the storm had interrupted it. It was Donna Pruitt, of all people, who first told me something was wrong. She caught me in the driveway one afternoon and said, carefully, that my mother had stopped answering her door after dark, even for people she recognized, even for Donna herself bringing over a casserole one evening. She said my mother kept every light in the house on until well past midnight, long after my father had gone to bed, and that she'd seen her, more than once, sitting alone at the kitchen table at 11 at night, just watching the street through the front window. I sat with my mother on her porch the following weekend and asked her directly what was happening in those late hours, and for a long time she didn't answer, just watched the street the way Donna had described, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I keep thinking I'll see headlights that don't belong," she finally admitted. "I know it's over, Grace. I know those men are in prison and Daniel isn't going anywhere and none of us are in danger anymore. But some part of me hasn't caught up to what my head already knows. I sit up because some old animal part of me is still standing guard, even though there's nothing left to guard against." I recognized that feeling immediately, because I'd been living inside a milder version of it myself for months. The particular lag between the danger actually ending and the body finally believing it. I told her about Dr. Okafor, gently, without pushing, and to my surprise, she agreed to see him too. A decision I don't think the mother I'd grown up with, a woman who considered therapy something other people needed, would have made even a year earlier. It took her the better part of a year to stop keeping every light on past midnight, but she did, eventually. And the night I noticed the house finally dark and quiet when I drove past at 11, I sat in my car outside for a minute longer than I needed to, just feeling the particular relief of watching someone you love find her way back to feeling safe in her own home. I hadn't expected to be called as a witness in Marino's trial, but Meredith Cassidy warned me, months before it started, that the prosecution wanted my testimony about the eviction night and the shelved police report as part of establishing the broader pattern of intimidation and corruption the case rested on. I spent weeks dreading it more than I dreaded almost anything else in the entire ordeal. The idea of standing in a courtroom a few dozen feet from a man whose organization had put my parents on cardboard in a thunderstorm, and describing that night out loud in careful, unemotional legal language to a room full of strangers. The morning of my testimony, Daniel drove me downtown and sat in the gallery the entire time, and I remember catching his eye once, halfway through the prosecutor's questions, and feeling something steady itself in my chest just from that brief contact. I described the phone call from Donna, the drive through the storm, the sight of my parents huddled on cardboard, the SUV parked outside my own house. I did not look at Marino while I spoke, though I could feel his attention on me the whole time, a cold, appraising weight I did my best to ignore. The defense attorney, a smooth, expensive-looking man who'd clearly been hired with money extracted from families far less fortunate than mine, tried to suggest during cross-examination that the eviction had simply been a private family matter blown out of proportion, that there was no evidence connecting his client directly to what had happened in my living room that night. I answered his questions as calmly as I could manage, but something in me finally cracked, just slightly, when he suggested that my parents' suffering that night had been, in his words, regrettable, but unrelated to my client's business dealings. My parents nearly died of hypothermia because a man employed by your client parked outside my house to intimidate my family into silence, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I don't know what you'd call that if not related. The judge sustained an objection before I could say more, but I saw in the jury box at least 2 jurors nodding slightly, and I left the stand that day feeling, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, like I had actually been allowed to say the thing out loud in a room where it mattered. Marino was convicted on all major counts 11 weeks later. I wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict. Daniel and I had agreed by then that we'd both had enough of that particular building for a lifetime. But Agent Alvarez called me personally to tell me, and I sat on my own back porch that evening, in the fading June light, and cried the specific, exhausted tears of a person finally, fully allowed to stop bracing for the next blow. It was almost a year after the storm before Daniel finally told me the rest of what that separate savings account had originally been meant for. A conversation that started, oddly enough, because I found an old real estate listing bookmarked on his laptop for a plot of land about 40 minutes outside the city, near a small lake I'd once mentioned in passing years earlier, as the kind of place I'd want to retire someday. I found that land the year after we got married, he admitted, sitting across from me at our kitchen table one Sunday morning, looking almost embarrassed in a way I rarely saw from him. I've been putting money aside for it, a little at a time, for years. My plan was always to surprise you on our 10th anniversary, buy the land outright, no mortgage, and build something small and ours from the ground up, no interference from anyone, just the 2 of us designing exactly the life we wanted. That's the money you moved to protect my parents, I said, understanding finally the full shape of what he'd actually given up that week. It didn't feel like a sacrifice at the time, he said. It felt like the only decision that made any sense. I remember sitting in my truck outside the bank, transferring almost all of it into an account Alvarez's team could access on short notice, and thinking, if this is what it costs to keep your dad alive, it was never really mine to keep in the first place. I didn't know what to say to that for a long moment, so I just reached across the table and held his hand, feeling the particular weight of loving someone who had quietly, without ever asking for credit, given up a years-long dream the instant it came into conflict with my family's safety. We didn't rebuild the anniversary surprise exactly as he'd originally planned it. Some things, once their secrecy is gone, can't quite be recreated the same way. But 2 years later, on our 8th anniversary, we did finally buy a small piece of land near that same lake, together this time, planning every detail of it side by side instead of one of us surprising the other. It felt, in its own way, like a better version of the gift he'd originally intended, because it belonged to both of us equally from the very beginning, built on a foundation of full honesty instead of a well-meaning secret. We started a tradition that first autumn after the trial ended, one that's held steady every year since. Sunday dinner at my parents' townhouse, all 4 of us, no exceptions unless someone was out of town, and even then, we'd sometimes put a laptop at the empty seat and video call them in so the ritual wouldn't break. The first few of those dinners were quiet, careful things, everyone still finding their footing around a table that had so recently been the site of so much fear. My father would ask Daniel small, tentative questions about his work, testing the water of a relationship that had nearly been destroyed, and Daniel would answer them, fully, patiently, the way you'd talk to someone you were genuinely trying to earn back, rather than someone you assumed already trusted you. It was my mother, characteristically, who broke the ice for good, about 2 months in, by bursting into slightly hysterical laughter over dinner one night at the memory of Patricia's expensive china cup rattling on its saucer the night of the confrontation, a detail that had haunted her for weeks as a symbol of everything wrong with that family, and which she suddenly found, months later, with enough distance, absurdly funny instead. Once she started laughing, the rest of us followed, and something in the room finally, genuinely loosened. By the following spring, those Sunday dinners had become the anchor of our whole family's week, the thing everyone privately organized their schedules around without ever needing to say so out loud. My father brought fresh tomatoes from his garden every summer, insisting on cooking at least one course himself despite my mother's gentle protests about his knife skills. Daniel took over the grilling duties without ever being asked, the way he'd always quietly taken over small domestic tasks throughout our marriage, and I found myself, watching him stand at the grill with my father beside him, offering unsolicited advice about the right internal temperature for chicken, feeling something in my chest settle completely for what felt like the first time since the whole ordeal began. We never spoke much about the details of that week at those dinners. Not directly. Not for the first year or 2. It existed instead as a kind of quiet, shared understanding underneath everything else we talked about. The reason we all showed up every single Sunday without fail. The reason nobody in that family took an ordinary meal together for granted anymore. I said earlier that Patricia showed up at our door 6 weeks after the arrests, asking for a way back into Daniel's life. And I want to tell the rest of that story properly, because I think it says something true about how forgiveness actually works, when the person asking for it has genuinely earned some skepticism. Daniel didn't refuse her outright, but he didn't rush to forgive her either. He set terms, plainly, the first time she came to the house. No contact with my parents unless both of them were comfortable with it. Full honesty about her finances going forward, since her financial desperation had been at the root of so much of what happened, and regular attendance at the court-mandated counseling, which he made clear he'd be checking on, not out of control, he said, but because he needed to see sustained effort, not just an apology delivered once and never followed up on. Patricia bristled at the terms initially, I think expecting that her status as his mother would simply override any conditions he tried to set, the way it always had throughout Daniel's life. When he held firm anyway, something in her seemed to genuinely shift for the first time in the 8 months since Wayne had come into her life. She moved into a small apartment near her sister's place in Rockford, took a part-time job at a fabric store she'd apparently always secretly wanted to work at, and started sending Daniel a short, ordinary text every week or two. Nothing dramatic, just updates about her days, the kind of small, low-stakes contact that slowly, over the better part of 2 years, rebuilt something between them neither of us had expected to survive at all. She never fully reconciled with my parents, and I don't think any of us expected her to. But 18 months after the trial, she showed up unannounced at one of our Sunday dinners, sitting quietly at the far end of the table saying very little, mostly just listening. And when she finally did speak, it was to apologize directly to my father, in a shaking voice, for the things she'd said about him and my mother being freeloaders in a house he'd never once failed to take care of. My father, to his enormous credit, simply nodded and passed her the breadbasket and said, "Water under the bridge, Patricia. Eat something. You look thin." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not the sweeping, cinematic kind. It was something smaller and, I think, more durable. The plain decision to let someone keep showing up and see what they did with the chance. I assumed, once Marino's trial ended, that Daniel's quiet, dangerous work with Agent Alvarez's task force was finished for good, and I want to admit that I felt a genuine wave of relief believing that. A relief that made it all the harder when I learned, about a year later, that he intended to keep going. He told me over dinner, carefully, the way he'd learned to tell me difficult things since the storm, directly, without softening the edges, trusting me to handle the truth rather than protecting me from it the way he once had. Alvarez had asked him to consult on a related case. Nothing as dangerous as the Marino operation, mostly reviewing financial records from his years in property management, but it meant, going forward, an ongoing relationship with the kind of world that had nearly cost my father his life. I won't pretend my first reaction was generous. I felt the old fear rise up immediately, sharp and physical, a full-body memory of 3 days spent not knowing if my husband would come home alive. We had a difficult conversation that night, one of the hardest of our marriage, in which I told him honestly that I didn't know if I could survive living through another version of that week. And he told me, just as honestly, that walking away from work that might prevent another family from experiencing what mine had gone through felt, to him, like abandoning something he owed a debt to. We didn't resolve it in one conversation. It took months of harder conversations, several sessions with Dr. Okafor that Daniel eventually joined, and a compromise neither of us loved completely, but both of us could live with. He would continue consulting in a limited, deliberately lower risk capacity, review work rather than field work, full transparency with me about every case he took on, and an absolute, non-negotiable line against ever again being asked to personally stage a confrontation the way he had with my family. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still nights I lay awake worrying about what he might not be telling me. Old habits of fear that Dr. Okafor helped me recognize weren't really about Daniel's current honesty, so much as the lingering echo of a week when honesty had, for good reason, been impossible. But it was an honest compromise, built together, out loud, instead of a secret one of us carried alone to protect the other. And I came to believe, over time, that the difference between those two things was the whole difference between a marriage that survives a crisis and one that doesn't. I think before that storm, I would have described myself as a fundamentally cautious person, someone who followed rules, trusted institutions, assumed that if something went badly wrong, the proper channels would eventually make it right. That week taught me something less comfortable and, in the long run, more useful. That the proper channels sometimes fail, quietly and without apology, and that a person has to be willing to act anyway, even without full information, even when acting means trusting instincts you've never had reason to test before. I think about the version of myself who sat in Meredith Cassidy's office, listening to her lay out exactly how thoroughly the system had already been bought and bent around my family's crisis. And I think about how easily I could have simply accepted that, gone home, and waited for someone else to fix it. Instead, something in me refused to accept that my parents' safety was a problem other people got to solve on their own timeline. I drove to a federal building and asked a stranger a question I had no right to expect an answer to. I called a phone number that turned out to belong to an FBI agent purely on instinct, at a moment when instinct was genuinely all I had left to go on. I don't say this to suggest I was heroic in any dramatic sense. Daniel was the one who spent months embedded in genuine danger. I mostly just refused to sit still while other people decided my family's fate for us. But I think that refusal mattered more than I understood at the time, both for the practical outcome of the case and for who I became afterward. I stopped, somewhere in the middle of that week, being a person who assumed the right authority would eventually handle things properly, and became, instead, someone who understood that sometimes you have to become your own authority, at least until the actual ones catch up. That shift has followed me into every part of my life since. I pushed for and got a promotion at work the following year, something I'd quietly wanted for a long time but had always assumed would come to me eventually if I just kept doing good work and waiting patiently. I stopped waiting. I made the case for myself directly, the way I'd learned to make the case for my parents in Meredith's office. And it worked. Not because the request itself was so different from what I might have made before, but because I finally believed I had the standing to ask. We broke ground on the little house by the lake 2 summers after the storm. A modest, single-story place with a wraparound porch and windows facing east, so the morning light would fill the kitchen the moment the sun came up. I designed most of the layout myself, working with a local builder Daniel had known for years, and there was something deeply satisfying about watching a physical structure rise out of ground we had chosen together, out in the open, with nothing hidden from either of us. It was on that same porch, the week the framing finally went up, that I told Daniel I was pregnant. I had taken the test that morning in the bathroom of our city apartment, sat with the news alone for almost 2 hours before I trusted myself to say it out loud without falling apart, and then driven straight out to the lake, where Daniel was meeting the contractor to go over the roof line. I found him standing at the edge of what would eventually become our living room. Nothing around him yet but studs and sky. And I didn't say anything clever or planned. I just walked up, took his hand, and said, "We're going to need a nursery, too." It took him a full 3 seconds to understand what I meant. And then his face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A kind of complete, unguarded joy I hadn't seen from him since long before the storm, since maybe ever, in 6 years of marriage. We told my parents that Sunday at dinner, and my mother burst immediately into the kind of loud, unrestrained crying she'd been rationing carefully since the trial ended, as though she'd been saving up an entire reservoir of relief and joy that finally had somewhere appropriate to go. My father, characteristically quieter, simply reached across the table and gripped Daniel's hand, holding it a beat longer than a normal handshake, and said, Good. This family could use some good news that doesn't come with a catch attached to it. Our daughter was born the following spring, 3 weeks before the lake house was finished, and we brought her home to the city apartment first, moving out to the lake that summer once the last of the paint had dried. We named her Louise, after my mother, a decision that made my mother cry for the second time that year, this time so hard she had to sit down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands for a full minute before she could speak again. My father retired fully from any part-time consulting work he'd still been doing the year Louise was born, and I think, watching him with her over the following years, that becoming a grandfather gave him back something the storm had taken, the sense of being someone essential to a child's safety and happiness, rather than someone who'd once failed to provide it. He built her a small raised garden bed of her own the summer she turned 3, scaled down to her height, and taught her, with the same patient seriousness he'd once brought to his own tomatoes, how to press a seed into soil and wait for something alive to come up out of the dark. She took to it with the fierce concentration only a small child can bring to something that adults consider simple, checking her seedlings every morning with a watering can nearly as big as she was, narrating her observations to anyone who would listen. Louise never knew a version of her grandparents defined by fear, which struck me, more than once, as one of the quiet, unexpected gifts of how thoroughly that whole ordeal eventually resolved. To her, my father was simply the man who taught her about tomatoes and told slightly exaggerated stories about the neighborhood raccoons. My mother was the woman who let her stay up late baking too much banana bread and never once told her no when she asked to lick the mixing bowl. She had no memory of cardboard boxes in a doorway, no memory of a night when both of them had genuinely feared for their lives. That erasure felt, to me, like one of the actual points of everything we'd fought for. Not that the danger had never happened, but that it hadn't been allowed to define the family Louise would grow up inside. I told her the story, eventually, in pieces as she got older. The way you tell a child a hard family history, honestly, but calibrated to what she could actually hold at each age. By the time she was old enough to understand the whole shape of it, in early adolescence, she asked me a question that startled me with its directness. Were you scared that Dad had actually turned into a bad person? I told her the truth. For about a week, yes. I was more scared of that than almost anything else that happened. But you kept looking for the truth anyway, she said, instead of just believing the worst thing and giving up. I did, I said. I think that's the part I'm proudest of looking back. Not that I never doubted him, that I refused to stop asking questions until I actually knew. She thought about that for a while, in the quiet, serious way she'd inherited from her grandfather, and then she said, I hope I'd do that too. And I told her I believed she absolutely would, because I'd watched her, even as a very small girl, refuse to accept an easy answer to any question that actually mattered to her. I want to circle back to Donna Pruitt, because I think her part in this story deserves more than a single frantic phone call in the opening pages. Donna had lived next door to my parents for almost a decade by the time of the storm, a widow herself, retired after 30 years teaching middle school English. The kind of neighbor who notices things other people walk past without a second glance. She told me, months later, over coffee at her kitchen table, that she'd almost talked herself out of stopping that night. It was late. She was exhausted from picking her son up at the train station. The rain was coming down hard enough that most people would have kept driving and told themselves someone else would handle it. She said something about the shape of my mother, huddled against the wall, made her slow the car despite every reasonable instinct telling her to keep going. I almost didn't call you first, she admitted, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. My first instinct was 911, But your mother grabbed my arm before I could dial and begged me not to call the police. Said she was scared of what Wayne's people might do if it looked like she was trying to get anyone locked up. She said, "Call Grace. Just call Grace. She trusted you to handle it better than any stranger could." That detail undid me a little, hearing it for the first time. The image of my mother, freezing and terrified, still clear-headed enough to insist on trusting her daughter over an anonymous emergency line. I thanked Donna as sincerely as I knew how, and in the years since, we've made sure she's never missed a single Sunday dinner invitation, an honorary member of a family she quite literally helped save from a night that could have ended so much worse than it did. Donna, for her part, always waves off the gratitude with the brisk practicality of a woman who spent 3 decades managing classrooms full of teenagers. "I just made a phone call, Grace," she says every time. "You're the one who drove through a hurricane to get to them." I've stopped arguing with her about it, mostly, though I privately believe both things can be true at once. That a single, ordinary act of paying attention, of refusing to simply drive past something wrong, can be exactly as essential as anything the people directly involved go on to do about it. I stayed in touch with Meredith Cassidy long after our case officially closed. First out of simple gratitude, and later out of a genuine friendship that surprised us both. Over coffee about a year after the trial, she told me something that reframed the entire ordeal for me in a way I hadn't expected. "You were lucky in a strange way," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Not lucky that any of it happened, obviously. Lucky that your husband had the resources, the relationships, and the specific skill set to eventually turn the tables on the people targeting your family. I've had clients in situations that looked almost identical on the surface. An elderly parent's house targeted by someone with mob financing behind them, where there was no informant on the inside, no federal task force already circling, just an ordinary family with no leverage at all against people willing to use real violence to get what they wanted." That conversation stayed with me for a long time. It made me profoundly grateful for how our particular story had resolved, and it also made me newly aware of just how many families face some version of that same vulnerability without any of the fortunate coincidences that had ultimately protected mine. Meredith mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd been trying for years to get more pro bono hours allocated at her firm, specifically for elder financial exploitation cases, an area of law she said was chronically underfunded and underprosecuted, precisely because the victims were often isolated, easily intimidated, and reluctant to make waves. I asked her what it would take to actually make a dent in that problem, and by the end of that conversation, I'd agreed to help her organize a fundraiser through my company's community outreach program, something I'd never once considered doing before that whole ordeal, but which suddenly felt like the most obvious use of the platform I had. That first fundraiser, held the following spring in a rented banquet hall downtown, raised enough to fund a full year of pro bono elder protection casework at Meredith's firm. And it became, over the following years, an annual tradition I looked forward to more than almost anything else on my calendar. A tangible way of turning the worst week of my life into something that occasionally, quietly, helped a stranger avoid living through a version of it themselves. It took almost 2 full years before a thunderstorm stopped meaning anything other than weather to me. For a long time after everything resolved, the specific sound of hard rain against a window would send my pulse climbing before my conscious mind even caught up to why. My body reacting to a pattern it had learned during the worst week of my life, long before I could talk myself down from it. I remember the exact night that finally changed, because it surprised me enough that I still think about it. Louise was a little over a year old, and a spring storm rolled through Chicago with the same biblical fury as the one that had started everything. Thunder loud enough to rattle the windows of our lake house, Rain coming down in the same sideways sheets I remembered from that first terrible night years earlier. I lay in bed, waiting for the familiar tightness to grip my chest, bracing for the anxious loop of thoughts that storm sounds had reliably triggered for 2 years running. It didn't come. Instead, I found myself simply lying there, listening to the rain drum against the roof, Daniel's steady breathing beside me, Louise's soft monitor hiss coming from the nursery down the hall, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, that a storm was just a storm again. Loud, a little dramatic, entirely ordinary. I woke Daniel gently, just to tell him, and he understood immediately what I meant without needing much explanation, pulling me closer and saying, quietly, "That's a good night, Grace. That's a really good night." I think healing rarely announces itself the way movies suggest it will, with some single dramatic breakthrough moment you can point to afterward as the turning point. For me, it arrived instead as an absence, the specific, quiet absence of a fear that had simply, gradually, worn itself down to nothing over 2 years of ordinary safety accumulating night after night, until one storm finally passed through without leaving anything behind but wet grass and a slightly muddy garden my father would grumble about the following weekend. Salvatore Marino's organization had a longer reach than any of us fully appreciated at the time. And I want to include one detail from those first 2 years that I've never told anyone outside my immediate family, because it still unsettles me slightly to think about, even now. About 8 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived at our Old City apartment, addressed to Daniel, with no return address and a postmark from the correctional facility where Marino was serving his sentence. Daniel opened it alone, in his study, and I found him sitting very still afterward, the letter face down on his desk, his jaw tight in a way I recognized from the worst days of the whole ordeal. He showed it to me eventually, after Agent Alvarez confirmed there was nothing actionable in it, nothing that constituted an explicit threat the prison system could act on. It was, instead, something colder and more unsettling than an outright threat. A rambling, almost philosophical letter in which Marino described in detail how thoroughly he'd once trusted Daniel, how betrayal like that has a way of finding its way back around eventually, and how he hoped Daniel's daughter grew up somewhere quiet. We reported it immediately, and Alvarez's office took it seriously enough to flag Marino's outgoing correspondence going forward and to run a fresh security assessment on our home and the lake property. Nothing ever came of it directly, no further contact, no evidence of any active plan, but it took months before either of us stopped double-checking the locks each night, before Daniel stopped walking the perimeter of the lake property before bed out of a habit neither of us wanted to name out loud. I think about that letter sometimes. On the rare occasions my mind drifts back to the darker corners of that whole story. And what I've come to understand is that some fears don't fully resolve just because the legal case does. Marino is still, as of this writing, serving his sentence with no possibility of parole for many years yet. But the particular, low hum of vigilance his letter reawakened in both of us never entirely disappeared. And I think it's honest to say that some part of our family's safety, going forward, will always depend on a wariness we never asked to have to carry, learned the hard way, during a week neither of us will ever fully stop carrying with us. I mentioned earlier that Daniel cried at my grandfather's funeral, but I want to describe the only other time I ever saw him break down completely in 6 years of marriage before the storm, because I think it matters to understanding the man underneath everything that happened. It was 3 years into our marriage, long before any of this began, on the night his childhood dog died. Daniel wasn't a man who cried easily or often. I'd come to think of him, in fact, as almost too composed. someone who processed grief quietly and privately, rather than out loud where anyone could see it. That night was different. He'd driven 2 hours to his mother's house to be with the old dog in its final hour, and when he came home well past midnight, he sat down on the edge of our bed and simply wept, unguarded, for the better part of 20 minutes, while I held him and said nothing, understanding even then that some griefs don't need words attached to them, just presence. I bring this up because I think it explains something important about how he was able to carry the weight of that terrible week without ever once cracking in front of anyone who might have noticed and reported back to Wayne or Marino's people. Daniel had always known how to grieve privately, to hold enormous feeling behind a controlled exterior until he was somewhere safe enough to let it out. It was a skill that had once simply been part of his temperament, a slightly worrying tendency toward emotional restraint that I sometimes gently teased him about. During the storm and its aftermath, that same tendency became the exact quality that kept my parents alive. His ability to look, convincingly, like a man capable of throwing his own in-laws out into the rain, while carrying, underneath that mask, a devastation he couldn't let show even once. I asked him once, months after everything resolved, where he'd actually let himself fall apart during that week, because I knew he must have somewhere, away from anyone who might have reported his real feelings back to the people watching him. He told me it had happened alone in his truck, parked in an empty lot near the office where Wayne had been keeping tabs on him, the night after the eviction. Sobbing until his chest ached, punching the steering wheel hard enough to bruise his own knuckles, before wiping his face, straightening his collar, and driving back to play the part of a man who felt nothing at all. I hadn't planned to talk about any of this publicly, but about 2 years after the trial, my company's internal newsletter asked me to speak at an employee wellness event about resilience during personal crisis, having heard a vague, second-hand version of what my family had gone through. I nearly declined. The idea of turning the worst week of my life into a corporate presentation felt, at first, almost obscene. I said yes anyway, eventually, because a colleague mentioned in passing that another employee on my team had recently been dealing with a family member's exploitation by a predatory lender and had no idea where to even begin looking for legal help. I realized, sitting with that information, that my silence about what had happened to my own family was, in its own small way, keeping other people isolated in exactly the way Marino's organization depended on families like mine being isolated, unaware that resources existed, unaware that other ordinary people had faced something similar and found their way through it. I gave the talk. I didn't share every detail. Some things still belonged only to my family, and I kept it that way. But I described the broad outline honestly. An elderly parent's home targeted by exploitation, a shelved police report, the discovery of legal and law enforcement resources most people don't know exist until they desperately need them. I ended by sharing Meredith's contact information and a list of elder protection resources I'd compiled with her help, printed on cards that I left at the back of the room for anyone who wanted one without having to ask for it publicly. 3 people took cards that day without saying a word to me afterward, which felt, oddly, like exactly the right outcome. Quiet, private help, finding its way to people who needed it, without requiring them to perform their own vulnerability out loud. One of them, a woman from the accounting department I barely knew, stopped me in the hallway almost a year later to tell me, quietly, that the referral had helped her aunt recover a home that had very nearly been taken from her through an eerily similar scheme. I've given some version of that same talk 3 more times since, at other companies, other community groups, and each time it gets a little easier to tell. and each time, at least one person finds their way to help they might not otherwise have known to look for. There's one more person from that terrible week I want to give a proper ending to before I close this out. Rosa Delgado, the housekeeper Patricia and Wayne had brought into the house during the brief period they'd controlled it, and who, I later learned, had quietly passed small pieces of information to Daniel throughout the ordeal, at real personal risk to herself, because she'd grown genuinely fond of my parents during the short time she'd overlapped with them before the eviction. Rosa had been in an impossible position that whole week, employed by people she quickly came to distrust, aware, in fragments, that something dangerous was happening in the house, and too afraid of losing her immigration status, which Wayne had at one point implied he could threaten, to go to the police herself. She'd instead found small, careful ways to help Daniel without ever making her allegiance obvious to anyone watching, slipping him information about Wayne's schedule, warning him once when Marino's men showed up unannounced a full hour earlier than expected. Once the case concluded, Daniel made sure Rosa was connected with an immigration attorney at no cost to her, helped her file a formal complaint about Wayne's threats that ultimately strengthened her own legal standing rather than endangering it, and, at my insistence, we quietly helped fund the first year of a small tailoring business she'd always dreamed of opening in her own name. She invited us to the shop's opening 2 years later, a small storefront on the south side with her name painted carefully above the door. And standing there, watching her cut ribbon on something entirely her own, I felt a version of the same warmth I'd felt watching my father's tomatoes come back thicker than ever, the specific, hard-won satisfaction of watching someone reclaim a piece of stability that had once been genuinely, frighteningly at risk. Rosa cried when she hugged me that day and told me, in a mixture of English and Spanish I didn't fully follow but understood completely from her tone, that she'd never expected the family she'd been quietly, secretly helping to end up being the ones who helped her build something of her own in return. I told her the truth, which was that none of us would have made it through that week without people like her willing to take quiet risks nobody ever properly thanked them for at the time, and that the shop, and everything that had gone into it, was the smallest possible repayment for a debt that could never really be settled in full. I need to tell you about the night, 4 days into the ordeal, when I sat alone in my hotel room and genuinely considered taking off my wedding ring for good, because I think leaving it out would make the eventual resolution feel too easy, too inevitable, when at the time it felt like anything but. It was the third sleepless night in a row. My parents were finally, mercifully asleep in the next room. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the water running so the sound would cover any noise I made, and I looked at the plain gold band on my finger and thought, with a clarity that frightened me, that I might be looking at the end of my marriage, regardless of whatever explanation eventually surfaced. Even if there was a reason, I remember thinking, even if it turns out to be a good one, I don't know if I can build a life with a man capable of looking at me the way he looked at me in that living room, capable of watching me pack a suitcase without saying a single word to stop me. I took the ring off that night. I set it on the edge of the bathroom sink and looked at my bare finger for a long time, feeling a strange, hollow kind of grief, mourning a marriage I wasn't even certain yet had actually ended. I put it back on the next morning, not because I'd resolved anything, but because some stubborn instinct told me the decision deserved more information than 4 days of fear and confusion could give me. I think about that night often, because I believe it's important to admit that even a story that ends in reconciliation can pass through a real, honest moment of near-permanent rupture along the way. I wasn't holding on to Daniel out of blind loyalty that whole week. There was a night I genuinely let go, if only for a few hours, And the fact that I picked the ring back up the next morning wasn't romantic certainty. It was simply a decision to keep gathering evidence before I let myself close a door I might not be able to reopen. I told Daniel about that night, eventually, months later, and he didn't flinch from it the way I half expected him to. "You should have taken it off," he said quietly. "If everything you knew that week had actually been true, leaving it on would have meant you'd stopped trusting your own judgment. I'm glad you put it back on. But I never once expected you to, and I would have understood completely if you hadn't." Daniel had a younger sister, Caroline, who lived in Denver and had been mostly absent from our lives for years, a casualty of an old, unresolved rift with Patricia that predated my marriage into the family entirely. I want to include her small part in this story because it surprised me, and because I think it shows how a crisis can sometimes repair relationships that have nothing directly to do with the crisis itself. Caroline called Daniel out of the blue about 3 weeks after the arrests, having heard a garbled version of events through a cousin, and the two of them talked for almost 2 hours, longer than they'd spoken in years combined. She flew out the following month for one of our Sunday dinners, nervous and a little stiff at first, clearly uncertain of her welcome after years of distance. And I watched my father, of all people, put her instantly at ease by asking her detailed, genuinely curious questions about her work as a physical therapist. The kind of unhurried attention that made people feel like the most interesting person in the room. Caroline and Daniel's relationship didn't fully mend in a single dinner, but it opened a door that had been closed for the better part of a decade. And by the time Louise was born, Caroline had become a regular, beloved presence in our lives, flying out for birthdays, sending Louise ridiculous, oversized stuffed animals for no occasion at all, teaching her, on one memorable visit, an entire clapping game that Louise performed for the rest of us with great pride for months afterward. I asked Caroline once, at one of those Sunday dinners, what had finally made her pick up the phone after years of silence, and she said something that stayed with me. "I think some part of me always assumed our family was simply broken beyond repair, and I'd made peace with staying away rather than risk finding out I was right. Hearing what Daniel had actually done, hearing that he'd been willing to sacrifice everything to protect people he loved, made me realize I'd been protecting myself from disappointment instead of actually trying. I didn't want to keep doing that anymore." It was, I thought, one of the more unexpected gifts the whole ordeal produced. Not just a marriage repaired and a family saved, but an estranged sister finding her way back into a family she'd quietly, sadly, assumed had no room left for her. People who eventually hear some version of this story almost always ask me the same question. Knowing everything now, would I have wanted Daniel to tell me the truth from the beginning, even at the risk of the operation collapsing? I've turned that question over more times than I can count, and I've never landed on an answer I feel completely settled about, which I think is itself an honest answer. Part of me, the part that spent a week grieving a marriage I thought had ended, wants to say yes without hesitation, that no operation, no case against any criminal organization is worth the particular anguish of believing the person you love has become a stranger capable of real cruelty. That week cost me something I don't think I've ever fully gotten back. A certain baseline assumption of safety inside my own marriage that I've had to consciously rebuild rather than simply resume. But another part of me, the part that watched Agent Alvarez explain what a premature warning might have cost, understands that the alternative Daniel was weighing wasn't a choice between my comfort and my ignorance. It was a choice between my temporary, agonizing belief that he'd betrayed us and a real, substantial risk that my father might not have survived the actual danger at all. When I frame the choice that starkly, the version where I spent a week in pain but my father is still alive to plant tomatoes every summer, is not a difficult version to choose, even in hindsight, even knowing exactly how much that week cost me. I think the honest answer, the one I've finally settled into after years of turning the question over, is that I don't wish Daniel had told me sooner. I wish, instead, that no situation like that had ever existed in the first place. That Wayne Duggan had never gambled his way into debt with a violent man. That Patricia had never been desperate enough to go along with a scheme targeting her own former in-laws. I wish the whole underlying crisis away, rather than wishing away the specific way Daniel chose to survive it. That's not a satisfying answer for people looking for a clean moral lesson about honesty in marriage. But it's the truest one I have, and I've stopped apologizing for its complexity. Our 7th wedding anniversary fell exactly 4 months after the storm, and I want to describe how strange and tender that particular day felt, because it was the first significant marker in our marriage's calendar to arrive on the other side of everything that had happened. Neither of us planned anything elaborate. We were both still, in different ways, recovering. Daniel from the physical injuries and the psychological weight of months of deception. Me from the specific damage of having believed, however briefly, that my marriage was over. We ended up doing something small instead, driving out to the plot of land by the lake, which we'd only just started seriously discussing buying, and sitting on a blanket in the tall grass, eating sandwiches we'd packed ourselves, watching the water go from silver to gold as the sun dropped. I don't have a gift, Daniel admitted, a little sheepishly as we sat there. I thought about it, and everything I considered felt wrong somehow. Too small for what we survived, or too big, like I was trying to buy my way past what happened instead of just sitting with it. You don't need a gift, I told him, and I meant it more completely than I think I'd ever meant a reassurance in my life. I think just being here, both of us, not performing anything for anyone, not hiding anything from each other, I think that's actually the best anniversary we've ever had, even though it doesn't look like much. We talked that afternoon in a way we hadn't quite managed to in the weeks since the arrests, not rehashing the specific details of what happened, which we'd already gone over exhaustively, but talking instead about what we actually wanted our marriage to look like going forward, what kind of transparency we needed to build into our daily life to make sure secrecy, even well-intentioned secrecy, never again became the default response to danger. We agreed, sitting there in the grass as the light faded, that whatever came next, we'd face it as partners with full information, even when full information was frightening, even when a kinder seeming lie might have been easier in the moment. I think of that anniversary now as the actual turning point of our marriage, more than the hospital hallway, more than the phone call from Agent Alvarez. It wasn't dramatic. It was just two exhausted, still healing people sitting in a field, choosing honesty over comfort. And I've come to believe that quiet, unglamorous choice mattered more to everything that came after it than any of the more cinematic moments in this whole story. I want to spend some time, before I close this story out, on the small, undramatic details of what our life actually looks like now, years past the storm, because I think those details matter more than any single climactic scene, and because I think they're the part other families going through their own version of crisis most need to hear. That ordinary life does eventually come back, in full, and that it feels, when it finally does, like the most extraordinary thing in the world. Daniel still handles the grill every Sunday. My father still brings tomatoes, more of them than any family could reasonably eat, so that half the neighborhood has grown accustomed to receiving surplus produce every August, whether they asked for it or not. My mother sleeps with the lights off now, has for years, and jokes when she remembers to, about the season she spent keeping vigil at her own front window like a woman in an old Gothic novel. Louise is 7 now, opinionated and fierce and utterly unafraid of thunderstorms, which strikes me, every single time one rolls through, as one of the quiet, private victories of everything we went through. That whatever fear that word once carried in our house, it never once made its way down to her. She knows the outline of the story, told carefully, at an age-appropriate level, and mostly she seems to find it interesting, the way she finds all family history interesting. A story about people she loves, rather than a wound she has to carry herself. Meredith Cassidy's Elder Protection Fund has grown every year since that first banquet hall fundraiser, now large enough to fund 2 full-time attorneys working exclusively on cases like ours used to be. Rose's tailoring shop has expanded twice, hired 2 employees, and become, by Rose's own proud report, one of the most reliable alteration services on her stretch of the South Side. Caroline visits from Denver at least 3 times a year now, and has become close enough with my mother that the 2 of them text almost daily about recipes. A friendship that formed entirely out of the wreckage of a crisis that, on paper, should have had nothing to do with either of them. None of this erases what happened. I don't believe in stories where trauma simply resolves into tidy redemption without leaving any lasting mark, and I've tried to be honest throughout this account about the marks that remain. The hypervigilance that took years to fade, the prison letter that still occasionally surfaces in my thoughts, the particular grief my father carried about his own sense of helplessness that summer. But alongside those marks, there is also this: a family that gathers every single Sunday without fail. A marriage rebuilt on a foundation of radical honesty neither of us had ever quite practiced before. A little girl who has never once had to be afraid of the people meant to protect her. I think that's the actual ending worth telling. Not that the storm never happened, but that it didn't get the last word. Since I started speaking publicly about parts of this story, I've had more conversations than I can count with women who reach out afterward, quietly, usually by email, usually starting with some version of the same sentence. I think something similar might be happening in my family, and I don't know what to do. I don't have a universal formula, because every situation is different, and I'm careful never to suggest that what worked for my family will work identically for anyone else's. But there are a few things I find myself saying in some form almost every time. I tell them to trust the specific nagging feeling that something doesn't add up, even when every visible piece of evidence points toward betrayal. Meredith taught me that instinct in her office that very first week, when she pointed out that Rick's plan made no logical sense if his goal was really what it appeared to be on the surface. I tell them that confusion is often a clue in itself, that when a cruel act doesn't actually serve the cruel purpose it appears to serve, it's worth asking what other purpose it might actually be serving instead. I tell them to build a paper trail of their own, quietly, methodically, the way I did with bank statements and old camera footage and a phone number I had no business calling. Not because everyone is secretly protecting them the way Daniel was protecting us, but because clarity, in the middle of a crisis, is worth pursuing for its own sake, regardless of which way the truth eventually points. And I tell them, gently, that they need to be prepared for the possibility that the truth, once uncovered, won't necessarily be a happy one. Not every man secretly staging a cruel scene turns out to be a hero underneath it. I got fortunate in the specific, complicated way that this story turned out. I try to be honest with the women who reach out that my ending isn't guaranteed, that sometimes the coldness in someone's eyes really is exactly what it looks like, and that the same investigative instinct that eventually vindicated Daniel would, in a different family story, have confirmed something devastating instead. I don't think that possibility makes the instinct to investigate any less worth following. I think it just makes the courage to actually look required either way. My parents still live in the same townhouse, the one this entire story circles back to, and I want to describe what it feels like now, years later, to walk through that front door, because I think the transformation of that specific physical space tells its own quiet version of everything else I've been trying to say. For the first year after everything resolved, I noticed my mother avoided the living room in the evenings, gravitating instead toward the kitchen or the small back sunroom, as though the room where Patricia had once thrown a lamp against the wall still held some residue of that night she couldn't quite relax inside. My father eventually replaced the sofa entirely, not out of any practical need, but because, he admitted to me once, sitting on that same cushion where Wayne had once lounged with such contempt made his skin crawl in a way he couldn't fully explain or shake. The new sofa sits in almost the same spot, but somehow the room feels entirely different now, filled instead with the accumulated evidence of 6 years of Sunday dinners, a growing gallery of family photographs on the wall, most of them featuring Louise at various ages, my father's reading glasses perpetually left on the side table, a soft blanket my mother keeps draped over the armrest that Louise has claimed as her own personal fort-building material on rainy afternoons. I asked my mother once, on a quiet weekday visit with no particular occasion attached to it, whether the house still carried any weight from that night, and she thought about it for a long moment before answering, in the careful, considered way she'd developed since her sessions with Dr. Okafor. "For a long time, yes," she said. "I used to feel like a guest in my own living room, like the walls remembered something I was trying to forget. But I think a house eventually becomes whatever you keep filling it with. We've filled this one with so many good Sundays since then that the bad night finally got crowded out. It's still there, somewhere underneath, the way a bruise stays somewhere under new skin, but it doesn't run the show anymore. I think that's as accurate a description of the whole family's healing as any I've managed to put into words myself, offered up, characteristically, by my mother in a single unpretentious sentence over a cup of afternoon tea. We had our son, Marcus, 2 years after Louise, and I want to describe the particular strangeness of experiencing new parent anxiety for a second time, now filtered through everything our family had survived, because I think it revealed something about how thoroughly the storm had reshaped my instincts as a mother. With Louise, my early fears had been ordinary new parent fears: sudden infant death syndrome, developmental milestones, the generic background hum of worry every new mother carries. With Marcus, I found myself, in his first year, quietly, almost embarrassedly cataloging a different kind of danger entirely. Who had access to our home address? Whether our security system's camera footage was actually being reviewed regularly, whether Daniel's continued limited consulting work with Agent Alvarez's successor task force carried any residual risk I hadn't fully accounted for. Dr. Okafor helped me recognize this pattern for what it was, not paranoia exactly, but a kind of protective hypervigilance that had simply found a new object to attach itself to, now that Louise's early years had passed without incident. He helped me build, over several sessions, a more measured way of holding that vigilance, acknowledging it as valid without letting it dictate every decision, distinguishing between reasonable precautions and fear-driven overcorrection. Daniel, for his part, made a decision around the time Marcus was born that surprised me, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. He stepped back from the consulting work with Alvarez's task force entirely, for good this time. No more limited or lower risk carve-outs, no compromise arrangement. He told me, holding Marcus for the first time in the hospital, that he'd realized, somewhere in the exhausting, joyful chaos of that first day, that he didn't want even a remote, well-managed connection to that world hanging over a family that had already paid so much to be free of it once. "I gave enough," he said simply. "I think it's someone else's turn to be the one who takes those risks now. I want to just be your husband and their father for a while, without a single complicated thing attached to that job description." I didn't argue with him. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me had been quietly hoping for exactly that decision for years, without ever feeling entitled to ask for it directly. I want to give Meredith Cassidy one more proper chapter before I close this story, because our friendship became one of the most unexpected, durable gifts to come out of that entire ordeal. And because I think her own life, unfolding alongside ours in the years since, deserves a place in this account. Meredith had been divorced for almost a decade by the time we met, focused entirely on her practice, half joking the first time I asked her about her personal life, that she'd traded romance for a career defending people whose families were falling apart, which she found, she said, considerably more reliable. I didn't think much of the comment at the time, but I remembered it 2 years later when she told me, almost shyly, over one of our now regular coffee catch-ups, that she'd started seeing someone, a soft-spoken high school teacher named Robert, who'd approached her after one of the elder protection fundraisers I'd helped organize, having been moved enough by her keynote speech to ask her to dinner afterward. I watched that relationship develop with the specific fondness of someone who felt, in some small way, responsible for having created the room where it started. Meredith and Robert married 2 years later, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city, and she asked me, to my genuine surprise and delight, to stand up with her as one of her attendants, an honor I hadn't expected from a professional relationship that had begun in the worst week of my life and grown, gradually, into something neither of us had anticipated. "You know," she told me at her own reception, a little emotional after a glass of champagne, "I used to think my job was just to win cases. Yours was the first one that reminded me it's actually about people getting their lives back afterward. I don't think I would have made the changes I made in my own life if I hadn't watched you and Daniel figure out how to actually rebuild something real, instead of just surviving the crisis and moving on." I told her the feeling was entirely mutual, that watching her fight for my family with the ferocity she'd brought to that first week had shown me what real advocacy actually looked like, and that I suspected neither of us would have become quite the same person without the other's unlikely presence in that terrible, formative stretch of both our lives. I heard from Denise Alvarez one final time, almost 4 years after the arrests, in a phone call I hadn't expected, and that closed a loop I didn't realize I'd still been carrying, quietly, in the back of my mind. She called to tell me, professionally, but with a warmth I hadn't heard from her during our earlier, tenser interactions, that Marino's appeal had been formally denied, exhausting his final avenue of legal recourse and effectively closing the case for good. She also told me something she said she wasn't technically required to share, but wanted to, out of respect for what our family had been through. That the evidence Daniel had helped gather during those final days had ultimately been used in 2 subsequent prosecutions of other members of Marino's network, cases that had protected at least one other family from a fate similar to ours before it could fully unfold. "I don't often get to make these calls," she told me. "Most of the time, once a case closes, that's the end of the relationship. I wanted you to know the full weight of what your husband did. It didn't just protect your family. It kept protecting people for years afterward in ways he'll probably never get to see directly. I thanked her, genuinely moved, and asked, somewhat impulsively, whether she ever thought about the toll cases like ours took on the families involved, whether the job ever felt heavier than the victories made it feel worth carrying. She was quiet for a moment before answering. Every single day, she said. But then I get a call like the one I'm making to you right now, telling a family the danger is finally, permanently over. And it reminds me why the weight is worth carrying. I hung up that day and sat with the phone in my hand for a long while, feeling for what I understood would probably be the final time, the specific, complicated gratitude of having been protected by systems and people who don't often get properly thanked for the cost of what they do. I want to write, briefly, about a particular kind of grief that doesn't get much attention in stories like this one. The quiet mourning of a version of your children's childhood that never got to exist, replaced instead by whatever reality actually unfolded, even when that reality turned out fine in the end. There's a version of Louise's early childhood in some other timeline where the storm never happened at all, where Wayne Duggan never developed a gambling problem, where Patricia never remarried someone dangerous, where Daniel never had to disappear into months of quiet, dangerous double life to protect us. In that version, Louise would have grown up with an uncomplicated set of grandparents who never spent a single night on cardboard, a father whose work never required a federal handler, a mother who never had to learn the hard way how to investigate her own marriage like a stranger's. I don't dwell on that alternate version often, but it visits me sometimes, usually at odd, unguarded moments. Watching Louise laugh at one of her grandfather's jokes, I'll suddenly think of the version of her that got to have this exact moment without the 6 years of family history that made it feel, to the adults in the room, so hard-won and precious. I've come to understand that this particular grief isn't really about wishing the past away. It's about mourning the ease that other families get to take for granted. An ease my family lost the right to feel unselfconsciously the night my parents ended up on that cardboard. Even though we eventually rebuilt something equally strong, maybe stronger, on the other side of it. I don't think this grief needs resolving, exactly. I think it just needs acknowledging. The way you acknowledge a scar that healed well but is still, undeniably, a scar. Louise's childhood turned out beautiful, secure, filled with grandparents who adore her and parents who chose honesty over easy comfort at every turn since the storm. It is also, quietly, a childhood built on the other side of something none of us would have chosen. And I think it's honest to hold both of those truths at once, rather than pretending the second one simply disappeared the moment the first one arrived. I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything after the storm became effortless harmony, because that wouldn't be honest. And I think stories that pretend crisis produces permanent, perfect understanding do a disservice to anyone trying to rebuild something real after their own hard season. Daniel and I still argue, sometimes about the same ordinary things every long-married couple argues about, and occasionally about something that traces, more directly, back to what we survived together. We had a genuinely difficult fight 2 years ago, for instance, over how much of the family's story to include when Louise's school asked students to interview a family member about an important event in your family's history for a class project. I wanted to keep the account vague, protective, sanitized down to something like, "Your dad helped stop some bad people." Daniel felt strongly that Louise, by then old enough to handle more nuance, deserved a fuller, more honest version, closer to the truth we'd always promised each other we'd hold on to, no matter how uncomfortable. We argued about it for the better part of a week, neither of us willing to simply defer to the other, both of us genuinely convinced we were protecting Louise in the way she actually needed. We eventually landed on a compromise, as we usually do now. A version of the story told honestly but without unnecessary detail about the more frightening specifics. Letting Louise ask follow-up questions if and when she wanted more, rather than either overwhelming her with everything at once or shielding her from a history that was, after all, legitimately hers to know. I bring this up not because it's dramatic, but because I think it illustrates something true about what actually rebuilding a marriage after a crisis like ours looks like, day to day. It isn't a permanent state of grateful, conflict-free harmony. It's two people who once discovered, the hard way, how catastrophic it is to make unilateral decisions about protecting each other without full communication, now working very hard, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with real friction, to never fall back into that old pattern again, even over something as comparatively small as a fourth-grade family history assignment. 2 years ago, for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, I commissioned a local painter to do a family portrait. All 6 of us by then, my parents, Daniel and me, Louise and Marcus, gathered on the back porch of the lake house on a warm September afternoon. It hangs now over the mantel in my parents' living room, the same room that once held Wayne Duggan's contemptuous sprawl across the sofa, the same room Patricia once stormed through with a lamp in her hand. I think about that transformation every time I visit. The specific, deliberate reclaiming of a physical space that had briefly, terrifyingly, belonged to people who meant my family harm, now filled instead with a painted record of 6 people who chose, again and again, in ways large and small, to fight their way back to each other. My mother told me, unveiling the portrait at the anniversary party, that she'd specifically asked the painter to include the garden visible through the window behind us, my father's tomato plants heavy and thriving in the background, because she wanted anyone looking at that painting for years to come to see not just the 6 of us, but the evidence of everything that had been carefully, patiently regrown in that yard since the worst night any of us had ever lived through. My father cried at the unveiling, quietly the way he cries at most things that matter to him now, no longer embarrassed by it the way I think he might have been before the storm taught him something about the difference between real strength and simply refusing to feel anything at all. He stood in front of that painting for a long time, running his thumb along the edge of the frame, and said, to no one in particular, "We made it back. Look at us. We actually made it all the way back." I don't think any of us needed him to explain what he meant. We'd all lived through exactly what he was measuring us against, and we all understood, standing together in that room, exactly how far we'd traveled to get there. If I could reach back to the version of myself sitting on that couch with a laptop, waiting for a text that never came, watching the clock climb toward 11 while a storm gathered outside, I don't know that I'd want to warn her about what was coming. I've thought about this often enough to trust the answer. I don't think I'd take that night away from her, even though I could. Even though some part of me still flinches remembering exactly how it felt to find my parents shivering under that awning. What I'd tell her instead is this. The man sitting across from you at that living room table, the one whose eyes look like a stranger's, is not the whole truth of who he is. Trust the 6 years of evidence you already have, even when a single terrible night seems to override all of it. Don't let one impossible scene erase a decade of small, consistent kindness. Ask harder questions before you accept the easiest, most painful explanation. And when you finally learn the truth, however strange, however costly it was to keep from you, choose to let it deepen your marriage instead of resenting it for the pain the secrecy caused you. I would also tell her something less comfortable, that surviving this will cost her something real, a certain unguarded ease she won't ever fully get back, and that this cost is not something to be ashamed of or to hide from the people who love her. I spent months, after everything resolved, feeling like I should simply be grateful and move on, as though residual fear or hypervigilance was some kind of failure to properly appreciate my own happy ending. I'd tell her, if I could, that healing isn't a debt you owe your good fortune. It's a process every bit as real and necessary as the crisis that made it required in the first place. And there's no shame in needing years of it rather than weeks. Mostly, though, I think I'd just tell her to hold on. Not blindly, not without asking questions, not without protecting herself and her parents by every means available to her, but to hold on to the marriage itself, to the family itself, long enough to find out what was actually true underneath the terror of that first terrible night. Because on the other side of that particular storm was a version of our family I could never have imagined. Sitting on that couch, waiting for a text message that, as it turned out, was never going to be the thing that explained anything at all. Detective work on cases like ours doesn't usually come with follow-up, but there was one exception in our story worth telling. A Chicago PD officer named Reyes, not directly connected to Alvarez's federal task force, who had been one of the very first responders the night we finally got a proper report filed after Meredith's persistent pressure at the precinct. Reyes had seemed, at the time, sympathetic but constrained, clearly uneasy about something he couldn't fully articulate, and I'd assumed, once the report got buried, that he'd simply moved on to other cases the way officers often have to. I was surprised, almost a year later, to receive a handwritten note at my office, forwarded through my company's front desk, from Reyes himself, apologizing for how limited his help had been that day, and explaining, briefly, that he'd since learned enough about the broader corruption connected to Marino's reach within certain precincts to understand exactly why our initial report had been so quietly deprioritized. He'd since transferred to a different division, specifically focused on rooting out that kind of internal compromise. And he wanted me to know, he wrote, that our case had been part of what motivated the transfer. A small personal reckoning with how close his own department had come to failing a family in real danger, simply because someone higher up the chain had financial incentives to look the other way. I wrote him back, thanking him, telling him that his apology meant more than he probably realized, and that I hoped his new work made it harder for future families to fall through the same cracks ours nearly had. We've exchanged a handful of letters since, nothing frequent, just occasional updates, and I've come to think of him as one more example of how a single crisis, handled honestly by the people caught up in it, can ripple outward in small, unglamorous ways that quietly make the whole system a little more trustworthy than it was before. I mentioned that Daniel stepped back entirely from consulting work with the federal task force once Marcus was born, and I want to describe what he built instead, because I think it says something meaningful about how a person can take the specific expertise gained through crisis and redirect it towards something constructive, rather than simply walking away from it altogether. Daniel started a small consulting firm the following year, focused specifically on helping property management companies and small landlords recognize the early warning signs of the kind of predatory financial schemes that had nearly destroyed our family. Training programs for staff on spotting coercive property transfers, workshops on the legal protections available to elderly homeowners, a hotline he helped establish in partnership with Meredith's firm for tenants or family members who suspected something similar to what had happened to us. It wasn't lucrative work, not compared to what he could have earned staying in commercial property management full-time, But he told me, the day he officially launched the firm, that he'd never once felt as certain about the value of his own work as he did building something explicitly designed to help other families recognize danger earlier than ours had. The firm grew slowly but steadily over the following years, eventually employing 4 people, including, to my genuine delight, Reyes, the detective who'd written us that apologetic letter, who left the police force 2 years after his transfer to join Daniel's team full-time, bringing with him a detailed, practical understanding of exactly how these schemes typically unfolded and how they could be interrupted earlier before a family ever ended up on cardboard in a doorway. I asked Daniel once whether the work ever felt like reliving the worst week of his life over and over through other people's crises. He thought about the question seriously before answering, the way he thought about most serious questions since the storm had taught him to slow down and actually sit with things rather than reacting from instinct alone. It does, sometimes, he admitted, but it also feels like the closest thing to redemption I know how to build. I can't undo what happened to your parents. I can't undo the week you spent believing I'd become someone else entirely. But I can make it a little bit harder for the next family to end up exactly where we did. And some days, that feels like the most useful thing I've ever done with everything I learned that year. Marcus, unlike his older sister, has never seemed particularly interested in the family history the way Louise eventually became, more focused, at 6 years old, on dinosaurs and the precise mechanics of his growing collection of model trains than on anything resembling the past. But he asked me a question once, unprompted, at bath time, that startled me with its accidental precision. "Mom, were you and Dad ever scared of each other?" I don't know what prompted it. Some overheard fragment of adult conversation, maybe, or simply the strange, sideways logic of a 6-year-old's mind connecting dots I couldn't fully trace. I sat on the edge of the tub for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without giving him more than he was actually equipped to hold at his age. "There was a time, a long time before you were born, when I was scared that something had changed in your dad," I said carefully. "It turned out I was wrong about what was actually happening. But for a little while, yes, I was scared." "What made you not scared anymore?" "I kept asking questions until I understood the truth," I told him. "And the truth turned out to be that your dad loved our family so much, he was willing to look scary for a little while in order to keep us safe." It was confusing, and it hurt my feelings for a bit, but it was never actually about him stopping loving me. It was the opposite. Marcus considered this with the particular gravity small children sometimes bring to information they're only half processing, more interested, ultimately, in dunking his plastic dinosaur beneath the bathwater than in pursuing the philosophical implications any further. But I thought about that exchange for days afterward, struck by how effortlessly he'd distilled the entire arc of the worst year of my life into a single, simple question a 6-year-old could ask without any of the surrounding context I'd spent this whole account trying to provide. "Were you ever scared of each other?" "Yes." And then, through more work than either of us expected to have to do, we weren't anymore. Oakwood Boulevard remembers that night too, in its own quiet, collective way, even years later. Donna Pruitt wasn't the only neighbor who noticed something had shifted in the weeks following the storm. The whole block, in the particular way small residential streets sometimes function like an informal community, seemed to absorb the story in fragments and respond to it with a kind of low-key, practical solidarity I hadn't expected. The Ferraros next door started leaving a spare key with my parents again, a habit they'd let lapse years earlier, as though some unspoken agreement had formed that watching out for each other mattered more now than it once had. The Chens across the street, whose son had grown up alongside a version of the Neighborhood Watch program that had mostly gone dormant over the years, revived it quietly, organizing a group text chain among the block's residents for exactly the kind of situation that had swallowed my parents whole one rainy night. Strange cars idling too long, unfamiliar faces lingering near a house that wasn't theirs. I don't think any of them ever expected their small acts of renewed vigilance to matter again in any dramatic way, and thankfully, they never had to. But my mother told me once that she found real comfort in it anyway. Not because she expected another crisis, but because it reminded her that the isolation she'd felt that terrible night, genuinely alone on a public street in the middle of a storm, with only a chance encounter with Donna standing between her and something far worse, wasn't going to be allowed to repeat itself on that particular block again. Not while people were paying attention to each other the way they'd started to since. Donna herself became something like an honorary aunt to Louise and Marcus over the years, showing up with homemade cookies for every birthday, teaching Louise, at her own insistence, actual cursive handwriting long after most schools had stopped bothering to teach it. A small act of old-fashioned care that Louise still, to this day, credits for the fact that she's the only kid in her class whose signature doesn't look like a scribble. I want to close the loop on something I mentioned earlier, the night I took my wedding ring off and set it on the edge of the bathroom sink, because there's a small coda to that story that I've never told anyone outside Daniel and my therapist. And I think it belongs here, near the end of this account. On our 10th anniversary, 3 years after the storm, Daniel gave me a second ring. Not a replacement for the original band I'd worn since our wedding day, but a slim, understated eternity band meant to sit alongside it. He didn't make a production of the gift, no elaborate speech, no restaurant reservation built around the reveal. He simply handed me a small box after Sunday dinner one evening, once my parents had gone home and the kids were asleep, and said, "I know rings don't undo anything. I just wanted something that marked the actual anniversary of when I think our marriage really started. Not the wedding day, but the day in the fields by the lake when we decided honesty mattered more than comfort, no matter what it cost either of us." I cried, a little, turning that new band over in my fingers, thinking about the night I'd set the original ring down on a bathroom sink and genuinely wondered whether I was looking at the end of everything. There was something quietly devastating and quietly beautiful about wearing both rings together after that. The first one, worn through genuine uncertainty and near collapse, and the second, chosen deliberately, with full information, by two people who'd already survived discovering exactly how fragile trust could become, and had rebuilt it anyway, on purpose, with their eyes open. I still wear both rings every day. Louise asked me once why I wear two, expecting, I think, some simple answer about tradition or sentimentality. I told her the truth, the shortest version I could manage for a child her age at the time. One ring is for the day we promised to try. The other is for the day we proved we meant it. She seemed satisfied with that answer, moving on quickly to whatever had captured her attention next. But I've thought about that exchange often since, because I think it's as close as I've ever come to summarizing this entire story in 2 short sentences. I want to end this account the way our weeks actually end now, most of the time, because I think an ordinary Sunday tells you more about what we actually built than any single dramatic scene from the worst week of our lives ever could. It's autumn again as I write this, the specific gold light Chicago gets in October settling over my parents' backyard. My father's tomato plants finally past their peak, but still producing enough for one last batch of sauce he insists on making from scratch every year, refusing all offers of help with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided this one task belongs entirely to him. Louise is 8 now, sprawled on the porch steps with a book she's supposed to be finishing for school and is instead reading purely for pleasure, a habit she inherited unmistakably from my mother. Marcus is somewhere in the yard with Daniel, the two of them absorbed in some elaborate game involving a soccer ball and rules that seem to change every few minutes according to whichever of them last scored. My mother is in the kitchen, humming along to the radio, rolling out dough for a pie she didn't need to make but wanted to anyway. The particular contentment of a woman who has, after everything, settled fully back into a life she once genuinely feared she'd lost the right to. Donna Pruitt is due to arrive in 20 minutes with a casserole nobody asked for and everybody will eat gladly. Meredith and Robert are joining us this week, along with Caroline, flying in for a long weekend, the guest list for these Sunday dinners having expanded, gradually, over the years, into something closer to a small community than a single nuclear family. I'm sitting on the back steps writing this final section by hand in an old notebook, because some stories feel like they deserve to be composed the slow way, and I keep looking up every few minutes at this ordinary, golden, unremarkable Sunday afternoon, thinking about a version of myself years ago who sat on a different couch in a different house, waiting for a text message that never came, with absolutely no idea that her whole family was about to be tested down to the studs and rebuilt, slowly, into something even stronger than what had come before. I don't know what storms are still ahead of us. I've learned the hard way that no family gets to assume safety is permanent, that love alone doesn't guarantee the people you're protecting will always understand in the moment that they're being protected at all. But I know this much. Sitting here on these steps with the smell of my mother's pie drifting out through the kitchen window. Whatever comes next, we've already proven, once, that we can survive the worst version of ourselves and come back from it whole. That's not nothing. In fact, I've come to believe it might be the only thing that actually matters. I've thought a great deal, writing all of this down, about what kind of story I actually wanted to tell. It would have been easier, in some ways, to write the version where a husband is simply exposed as a villain and a wife rebuilds her life without him. A clean story with a clear moral and an unambiguous ending. It would also have been easier to write the opposite version, where a single dramatic reveal instantly restores perfect trust and everyone lives happily ever after without any further complication. Neither of those versions would have been true. The actual story, the one I've tried to tell honestly across these pages, is messier than either of those. A marriage that came within inches of ending over a devastating misunderstanding. A husband capable of extraordinary sacrifice who also made a unilateral decision about my own safety that I'm still not entirely sure was the right one. A family that got fortunate in ways many other families facing similar predatory schemes never do. And a slow, unglamorous, years-long process of rebuilding trust that never fully erased what the crisis cost us, even as it built something genuinely stronger in its place. If there's a single thread I'd want anyone reading this to take away, it's this. The coldest, most incomprehensible cruelty you witness from someone you love is not always what it appears to be. But it's also not guaranteed to be a hidden act of protection either. The only way to actually know which one you're facing is to refuse the easy answer, whichever direction it points, and keep asking questions until you have real information instead of assumptions built on fear. That refusal cost me a week of profound anguish. It also, in the end, gave me back a husband, a family, and a version of myself I don't think I would have discovered any other way. My parents' house on Oakwood Boulevard still stands, deed still in my father's name, garden still producing more tomatoes than any reasonable family could eat. The storefront where Donna found them huddled on cardboard has since been leased to a small bakery that my mother now visits every week, buying more bread than we need, a small, deliberate act of reclaiming a space that once represented the worst night of our lives. And every single Sunday, without fail, 6 of us, soon to be more as Louise and Marcus grow and bring their own additions to the table someday, gather around a table that very nearly never got the chance to be gathered around again. And we eat, and we laugh, and we remember, quietly, underneath all of it, exactly how close we came to losing every bit of it, and exactly how hard we fought, each in our own way, to make sure we never did. If you found your way to this account because some part of your own life looks unsettlingly similar to what I've described here, a sudden, incomprehensible cruelty from someone you trusted, a family member in danger, a system that seems to be failing you at exactly the moment you need it most, I want to leave you with something more practical than sympathy, because I remember vividly how little comfort sympathy alone provided me during that week. Document everything, from the earliest moment you suspect something is wrong. Bank statements, phone records, photographs, timestamps, anything that creates a factual record independent of anyone's memory or interpretation. Find a lawyer who specializes in exactly your situation rather than a generalist, even if it costs more upfront, because specialized knowledge moved our case forward in ways a general practice attorney never could have managed. Don't assume the first authority you approach, a police officer, a caseworker, an official hotline, will automatically act in your family's best interest. Verify, follow up, and escalate persistently if something feels off, the way Meredith taught me to do at that first precinct desk. And if you're the one on the other side of this equation, the one who feels forced, for reasons you believe are protective, to deceive someone you love in order to keep them safe, please consider, before you commit fully to that path, whether there's any way to share even a fragment of the truth, some small anchor of trust the other person can hold on to through the worst of it. Daniel didn't have that option, constrained by an active federal investigation with lives genuinely at stake, and I've come to accept that his silence, in that specific and extreme circumstance, was probably the right call. But most situations aren't quite that extreme, and I'd encourage anyone facing a similar impulse toward protective secrecy to look hard for any version of the truth that can be safely shared. Because the alternative, even when it's ultimately vindicated, extracts a real and lasting cost from the people you're trying hardest to protect. I don't know how your particular story ends. I only know that mine, against every fear I carried through that storm, ended somewhere worth all the terror it took to get there. And I hope, whatever you're facing right now, that yours does too. I want to end with one small, physical object, because I think it captures something the rest of this account, for all its length, hasn't quite managed to say directly. I keep a single photograph folded into the back pocket of my wallet, worn soft at the creases from years of being carried around, taken by Donna Pruitt on her phone the morning after the storm, before any of us knew how the whole ordeal would eventually resolve. It's not a flattering photograph. My mother's face is puffy from crying and lack of sleep. My father looks a decade older than he actually was that week, hollowed out by fear and cold. I'm barely in frame, just my shoulder and the edge of my jaw, caught mid-motion helping my mother into the car. Donna sent it to me weeks later, almost apologetically, saying she'd taken it instinctively, the way you sometimes photograph a moment before you've decided whether you want to remember it. and asking if I wanted her to delete it. I asked her to send it to me instead. I've carried it ever since. Not because I want to dwell in that fear, but because I want to remember. On the good days when it would be easy to take our Sunday dinners and our lake house and our ordinary golden autumn afternoons entirely for granted. Exactly how fragile all of it once was, and exactly how much work it took from every single person in this account to build something this solid on the other side of a night that could have gone so much worse. I showed the photograph to Louise once, when she was old enough to ask real questions about that period of our family's history, and she studied it for a long time, quiet in the particular serious way she gets when something matters to her, before handing it back and saying, simply, "You all look so scared." I told her we were. I told her that being scared and still finding your way through it anyway is maybe the most important thing a family can teach its children. More important, in the end, than teaching them never to be afraid at all. She nodded, folded the photograph back along its worn crease, and handed it back to me with the particular gentle care of someone who understood, even at her age, that she was holding something that mattered. That photograph is the truest artifact I have of everything I've written here. Not the trial transcripts, not the newspaper clippings about Marino's sentencing, not even the framed portrait over my parents' mantel, just two frightened elderly people and their daughter's shoulder, caught on a phone camera the morning after the worst night of our lives, carried in my wallet ever since as a reminder of exactly what we fought to get back, and exactly why every difficult year that followed was worth it. Before I set this account down for good, I want to name, plainly, everyone who made the ending of this story possible, because I think gratitude loses something important when it stays vague and general instead of specific and named. Donna Pruitt, who slowed her car down on a night when speeding past would have been so much easier. Meredith Cassidy, who believed my family's case was worth her full attention before she had any real reason to expect it would lead anywhere good. Agent Alvarez, who carried the weight of an operation that put people I love at real risk, and who called me herself at 3 a.m, rather than letting me hear the outcome secondhand. Rosa, who took real personal risk to pass along small pieces of truth from inside a house that had briefly, frighteningly, stopped belonging to us. Detective Reyes, who cared enough about a buried report to eventually change the whole direction of his career because of it. And Daniel, of course, more than anyone, a man who was willing to be hated, completely and convincingly, by the people whose love mattered most to him, because the alternative was a danger he wasn't willing to risk them facing. I don't know many people capable of carrying a burden like that in total silence, night after night, while the people around him grieved a version of him that wasn't real. I married a good man 6 years before the storm ever came. I don't think I fully understood how good until I watched exactly what he was willing to sacrifice and exactly how he chose to rebuild everything afterward. One transparent, deliberate, hard-won conversation at a time. This is where I'll leave the story. Not at the trial, not at the arrests, not even at the moment I finally understood the truth in that hospital room. I'll leave it here. On an ordinary autumn Sunday, 6 of us gathered around a table that very nearly stood empty forever, eating a meal none of us take for granted anymore. Grateful, in the deepest and most specific way I know how to be, for every single person who helped carry us back to this table, and for the stubborn, complicated, hard-won love that made every bit of the fight worth it. Someone once asked me, after hearing an abbreviated version of this story at one of those company wellness talks, whether I'd go back and change any part of it if I genuinely could. Not just soften the pain of that week, but erase the whole ordeal entirely. Wayne's debts and Marino's threats and the eviction and all of it. If some impossible power offered me the choice. I sat with that question longer than I expected to, because the honest answer felt, for a moment, disloyal to everyone who suffered through it. But eventually I told her the truth. Yes, without hesitation, I would erase every bit of it if I could. Not because of what we eventually built on the other side, but because no family should have to nearly lose each other in order to discover how much they actually mean to one another. The growth we found afterward doesn't retroactively justify the danger that produced it. My father shouldn't have had to sleep on cardboard to teach any of us anything. My mother shouldn't have needed to keep every light on until midnight for 2 years to understand her own resilience. But I don't get that impossible choice, and neither does anyone else living through their own version of this story. What I do have, what all of us have, is the choice of what to do with whatever actually happens, whether to let the worst night of your life define every day that follows it, or to fight, deliberately and patiently, for something better on the other side of it. We chose to fight. It cost us more than I can fully account for, even in an account this long. And it gave us back more than I ever thought we'd be lucky enough to have again. That's the whole of it. That's everything I know how to tell you about the night my parents slept on cardboard, and the 6 years since, and the family we built back out of the wreckage. One honest, difficult, ordinary Sunday at a time. If you are reading this because you needed to hear that families survive things that feel unsurvivable in the moment, I hope some part of this account gave you that. Ours did not survive because we were owed a happy ending, or because we deserved one more than any other family facing something similar. We survived because enough people, at enough critical moments, chose honesty over comfort, action over paralysis, and love over fear, even when every one of those choices came at a real and painful cost. I wish that for anyone reading this who needs it right now, wherever your own storm currently stands. Thank you for reading this all the way through. It took me a long time to be ready to write it down, and longer still to be ready to share it. If any part of it helps even one other family recognize danger a little sooner, or hold on to each other a little longer through their own version of an impossible week, then writing it down was worth every difficult memory it took to get the details right. Grace Bell Cross, Chicago, Illinois. For every family still waiting for their own storm to pass.